Why play Phoenix Point? 1000 hour impressions. This video is part tutorial, strategy guide, review, retrospective and comparison. Understandably this is a lot, but it's hard to talk around Phoenix Point without getting into the about of Phoenix Point. This is also a recommendation to download the Terror from the Void mod on the workshop, and jump back in if you felt that last time it never quite clicked for you, or if you were left unhappy with the state of the official release after the last DLC. This video will contain spoilers relating to enemies, equipment and unlocks. The TLDR of the whole thing is, you really should try it with the mod. But please don't turn off now that I've said this, because the video engagement will be atrocious if you do. The mod development team have done a fantastic job bringing the game to life, better balancing the numbers and adding more mechanical depth to a game which so desperately needed it. While Phoenix Point still isn't an easy game to love like other titles in the genre of turn-based tactics, it does have some fantastic layers to add to tactical combat, a few of which I wish other games incorporated more often. It has horizontal tech trees, a limb damage system, enemy evolution rather than simple enemy replacement, a fantastic and interesting foundation. It's all there, but it's buried in a simultaneously slow-paced and rapidly escalating combat that often ends up punishing new players too severely whilst they're still trying to learn and experiment with the mechanics. This appears to have caused many players simply to turn the game off and return to something more familiar that doesn't feel as unfair as Phoenix Point. I hope this video serves as a guide on how to better control the spread of the Pandora virus and tackle the deep sea monsters. So, with that out of the way, Part 1. What is Phoenix Point? Or how I learned to stop worrying and love the crab. Phoenix Point is a turn-based tactical squad management grand-ish strategy game. Immediate points of comparison will lean towards games like XCOM, Warhammer 40,000 Geoscape, or maybe Hard West. These games all scratch a different tactical itch, with alternate systems designed to challenge the player in a number of different ways. Many players will consider the granddaddy of this genre to be XCOM and its numerous sequels, spin-offs and successors. I see XCOM as the Las Vegas of tactics games. It has bright lights, star attractions, huge payout numbers, and occasionally you wake up in a damp gutter missing a kidney when your overconfidence has got the better of you. While you can count cards, rig the deck, bribe the dealer, or try and weight the dice, XCOM is fundamentally built around gambling. You play the percentages against the AI, with your fingers crossed that the odds land in your favour. The tactical impact you can impart upon the game is your approach to awakening individual pods of enemies at the right time, the squad composition that you send in, if you press your luck to get extra resources by rushing in, or if you play it safe to keep everybody alive so that you can get home poor but more experienced. XCOM is a rush because the risk is always apparent in clear numbers, and the cock-up cascade that can occur from a single botched action is something unrivaled by other games of this genre. So beating those odds, it's fantastic. You feel like you've walked in, cheated right under the pit boss's nose, and he's even thanked you for your patronage as you strode out, arms brimming with ill-gotten riches. However, when XCOM goes wrong... So, in XCOM 2, I had a VIP extraction mission, with only 2 turns remaining before the turrets that were defending a scientist would run out of ammo. It would leave the scientist defenceless. He was set to be overrun by the Lost, a zombie-like race that scrambles to swarm and overwhelm you. We needed the reward from this mission badly, which meant the scientist had to come back with us by using his own legs, not being dragged in a body bag. So I pushed ahead, ignoring these dangers. Without 2 turns of dashing movement, we would not reach him in time. As the turn ended, a lone sectoid flanked my ranger. I knew a critical hit was likely now, so that means the soldier would die. We'd never reached that scientist in time, and not only did I throw away a life because of my own hubris, but then the sectoid takes a shot, and it misses. The sectoid misses! I watched plasma sail harmlessly over this ranger's head, and I let out an audible gasp of relief. That was the only Xeno in any position of threat to my entire squad. Then I heard the mist plasma find a target. It had splashed against a car. The car that was conveniently located right next to the scientist. I saw the sparks fly and the fire began to burn. The plasma had hit the fuel. The car was now a bomb. But it was fine. I still had a turn. Except when my turn started, the camera panned over to the scientist and the car detonated. A plume of fire shot into the sky and smoke flooded his makeshift defences. His corpse was thrust awkwardly into nearby sandbags. The explosion was loud. Too loud. The Lost poured into the city after being alerted by the sound, and the ranger that I'd rushed forward wasn't experienced enough to have Bladestorm. Being so far away from the squad, it had left him exposed. He didn't make it back. His final moments were spent cutting down the sectoid before he was beaten to death with his own legs by the Lost. Stories like that, they're the ones that stick with you. The flowchart of events was entirely down to RNG. It was a gamble, with the percentage gods either smiling upon you or smiting you down at any given moment. I lost that roll, but I got a fantastic story from it, which means I come away with something of value. A lesson learned. A squad with a revenge arc to complete. A poster to make commemorating that soldier who stayed behind so that others could live. A poster I later occasionally saw on walls scattered around the city, reminding me of just what we were fighting for. So let's compare this to Phoenix Point. Well, Phoenix Point is maths. You're handed a 35% chance to hit for 3 to 5 damage in XCOM, whereas Phoenix Point hands you a chance to hit from 0 to 6 times for 30 damage a shot before considering armour, which can also be affected by every shred that is applied on the shot, all while giving you no definite indication of if the shots are even all going to necessarily land on the same limb or even the same target. What you get is a maths puzzle every single turn. All enemies are active from the start of the mission. You can't wait out pods or surgically pick them off one by one without some very specific team compositions. You're given a finite amount of damage that you can deal every turn and presented with all of the enemies, their exact health, armour, mobility, damage, abilities, all of which you need to consider and place a level of threat on so that you can prioritise what to deal with first. Your sniper's going to be fantastic at disabling limbs. Your heavy can shred down large targets to allow for classes like the Assault to hit for unmitigated damage against that specific limb. A priest can exploit mentally weak enemies and turn what would be a danger into a huge meat sponge, or even better, a new, deadly source of damage that you can use. If your toolkit in XCOM is an increasingly weighted dice and marked cards, Phoenix Point is like being handed a scientific calculator that explodes if you don't do the equations in the correct order. When I played XCOM 2, I had a mental checklist that I was running through. What was the safe movement range this turn? Whose action does the rest of the turn currently hinge on? What is the backup plan if this action doesn't succeed? You have a plan A, B, C, D. With Phoenix Point, the actions aren't quite so set in stone. The checklist is broader, it's almost overwhelming. You can shoot first, move second. You can move, shoot, move, popping in and out of cover, breaking line of sight that leaves the enemy without a retaliatory option on their turn. Do you necessarily need to kill this target, or would simply breaking a limb remove them from combat? If you do break a limb, what is their action priority going to change to? They may not be able to fire a gun or swing their claw, but do they now have access to a grenade? In which case, is it better to shoot them in the head, lower their will points? That means that if you kill a few other enemies, they're more likely to panic. The list of potentials is much more branching in Phoenix Point. However, with more branches comes a greater degree of accountability. If things go wrong in XCOM, the excuse is always, that's XCOM baby. The flowchart of bollocks decides how many branches to hit on the way down, and you'll need to consider whether you call in an extract to make it out with the scattered remains of your squad, or continue the fight and try to win, battered and bloodied. But if things go wrong in Phoenix Point, I shouldn't have taken that shot first. I should have made sure that unit was dealt with before doing that. I should have saved that grenade for this scenario. I shouldn't have moved that far. Without that RNG safety net to land in, you find that a lot of the blame, a lot of the regret, and a lot of the mistakes, they're all on you, the player, which is a lot harder to take. It took me streaming the game to stop rage quitting every single time a mission went south. With others watching, I just kinda had to roll with the consequences, rather than calling the game bullshit and hitting Alt F4. So what changed? This was a game that I was rage quitting, a game I've called unfair, somewhat poorly designed and badly balanced in the past, a game that I genuinely disliked when I first played it. What did it take for something in my brain to click and do a 180 for Phoenix Point? Part 2. Soldiers and combat, or why I carry more than just a hammer in my toolkit. To put into some perspective what Phoenix Point will offer a new player, you are first handed the Geoscape screen, resource management, base building, aircraft, 7 classes, an option of multiclassing, character stats, armour, modules, 16 weapon types, 14 damage types, utility items, mutations, bionics, vehicles, 3 factions, faction-specific research, enemy-specific research, 6 main classes of Pandoran which will heavily evolve over time, with 7 smaller classes. This isn't even counting everything the DLC includes, the random events you may encounter, or even starting to get into the variation on combat missions. Simply put, this is a lot. I'd never be able to cover everything Phoenix Point can offer on a mission-by-mission basis. The exact details of every enemy, the pros and cons of every weapon, class and skill. The best that I can do is lay a groundwork for what you've got to work with, what is going to be working against you, and hopefully why you should want to dive into this game, not be intimidated by this huge list of things to learn. Due to the nature of progress in Phoenix Point, it's really difficult to pick a clear and clean path to deliver this information. You're going to be handed new tech over time, new classes, new weapons, new options. If I made a video following the standard progression, you need to jump back and forth constantly to find the scattered bits of information you need. I've grouped this as cleanly as possible into chapters, and I'm hoping that I can explain things clearly enough not to overwhelm you, although I am expecting this may be a little bit of information overload for some, so don't worry. When I first played this game, it was exactly that way for me too. And I wasn't even following a guide. I was just dying dozens of times over and swearing at my monitor. So, in Phoenix Point, your main enemy, the Pandorans, evolve, which allows you to face larger and more varied threats as the game progresses. These enemies are randomly assigned on missions. They aren't guaranteed to turn up simply because they're new in the pool and you want to see them. You get some missions that will spawn a lot of weaker enemies with the idea of swarming you, others that have a handful of top tier Pandorans to basically act as a skill or gear check. For new players wanting to get field experience with an enemy, to try a fresh strategy, it could be 3, 4, maybe even 10 more missions before you get to see the one that you specifically had in mind, by which point it might have evolved into a higher rank, gained new abilities, stronger armour, or more dangerous offense. Because of things like this, learning what tools are at your disposal is vital to success. The kit that you're handed is unwieldy and alien when you first start the game. There's a lot of values, a lot of stats, types, different numbers everywhere. There are echoes of further tutorialization in the game on certain missions, but as a player you really are left to your own devices. A lot of moments in Phoenix Point come down to, let's test this for science and see what happens. If it works out, you might have learned a new strategy. If it fails, you'll most likely lose a soldier and not want to try it again. So, how can I best explain some of the science I've done? What should you be looking to learn from? How can I help minimise your frustration? So, these previously mentioned tutorial echoes are in the opening missions for each faction. These missions all have the same goal: kill all enemies, but vary wildly in the approach that you should take. And they let you dip your toe in the depths of the strategy ocean. Being able to pick apart what you should learn and take away from these missions, even if it's the smallest morsel of information, is the first step in the right direction, moving towards a positive learning experience rather than an aggravating one. The Disciples mission sees you against a swarm of poison worms, wiggling sacks of miasma that love nothing more than snuggling up against your soldier's leg and detonating into a cloud of deadly gas. You're expected to make use of close cover overwatch, which is more likely to ensure the bullets land on the target with the highest accuracy, advancing slowly so you can pull back if needed, covering the retreat. This mission is purely about learning movement ranges and how to keep your squad alive with caution, sightlines, and smart movement. You can also cheese it incredibly easily by simply climbing the scaffold in the level, as unsurprisingly, worms can't follow you up there. It allows you to pick them off from an entirely safe vantage point. New Jericho needs you to deal with madmen. They've taken position inside a small compound, so they have the locational advantage as well as wearing New Jericho's stronger, heavier armour and wielding their low burst, high damage rifle. The rifle is a two-handed weapon, so breaking an arm will stop the madmen from being able to shoot at you. It is vital to notice that the soldiers in this mission have the ability Return Fire. The starting rifle Phoenix uses by itself simply does not have enough damage in a full burst to get through the armour and hit the arm hard enough to break it, meaning if you charge your assault in, they'll take heavy damage from the counterattack and likely die due to being left wounded and exposed. This mission is the time for the heavy and the sniper to shine. The heavy not only does a large amount of shred, but the cannon can apply shock damage. You don't need to aim to break the arm when you can simply stun the enemy by aiming at centre mass and making sure every bullet hits. Equally, your sniper firing one high velocity round that does much greater damage means that the high armour value isn't enough to stop the bullet, meaning you can render these madmen unable to use their weapon with a single shot. Failing all of this, you do have the option of going loud. You can grenade over the compound walls, you can shred the madmen's armour down, which then allows your assault units to punch through the battered ballistic plates. This is a tutorial on limb damage and why a varied squad is so important. You don't always need to kill an enemy to cross them off the list of actual threats. Synedrian hands you the task of killing a group of thieves. Unlike the madmen, these bandits are wearing some of the worst armour in the game, and they don't have return fire. Your assaults are easily capable of inflicting enough damage to cause bleeding and break limbs. However, the thieves use pistols. Breaking an arm means that they are simply going to use the other. With pistols only costing 1 AP to fire, leaving a soldier stood next to a bandit at the end of your turn is likely going to result in taking 3 or 4 highly accurate shots to the head. This mission has a few approaches and some interesting tactics to implement. The pistols themselves can be targeted in free aim, and they aren't particularly strong, meaning it might be easier to disable the weapon rather than disable the wielder, if you can hit a target that small, that is. The bandits are also mentally weak. They can be made to panic with just a few losses to their group, which allows you to clean up the leftovers with minimal risk as they run around trying to recover. The map is also designed to help you hold a fortified position if you immediately break to the right of the spawn, funneling bandits in one by one. This allows your team to pick them off with concentrated fire. These missions are given to you the first time you encounter the appropriate faction, so you're likely to engage with them very early on. The tactics I've mentioned, however, aren't something you're going to know immediately, at least not on an enemy by enemy basis. So it's going to take some trial and error to know which of these approaches is required, and even then, those introductory missions are still very dangerous. A couple of poison worms going off can nearly wipe out a fresh recruit with the poison damage. The madmen do huge burst with their rifles, posing an enormous threat to everyone besides your heavy. Even then, the shred that they inflict soon turns your heavy armour into tissue paper. The thieves will quickly overwhelm you, and the accurate pistols that they use means that they're pretty much headshot magnets, due in part to the helmet always being the weakest armour that your soldiers wear. So if 3 thieves gang up on your sniper, each taking 2 or 3 shots, it's highly unlikely that your sniper's going to make it home. Can you see why this game is causing players to just give up? How are you expected to know all of this if you died to learn the lesson? They're some of the first missions that you're going to face, and if you can fail them, the campaign is basically over. It's not exactly a warm welcome to a tactics game, especially when this isn't a forced death sequence, like some other games feature to help you learn consequences in a more destined manner. All of this doesn't take into account that on the highest difficulty, these missions are then explained via a different enemy. The source of the poison worms is a Chiron that will spawn more worms throughout the fight. The madmen are being mind controlled by a disciple of our new priest, who can also mind control your units. The thieves are led by a Synedrian Infiltrator, who uses a poison crossbow, a massively advanced weapon for this stage of the game that hits for 50 damage with a 40 poison tick. and only cost 1 AP to shoot, that's a potential 290 damage a turn from that enemy, which is practically undetectable. You'll spend these missions with your thumb on the Alt key, biting your bottom lip, sounding like a deflating tyre as the enemy takes a turn, just waiting to slam F4 and start it all again. Obviously, that being said, new players aren't going to be starting their first game on Legend. This is something for returning players to experience and curse over when they encounter it. A fresh hell for being cocky enough to click the hardest setting. So that was what the game gave you. It's a crash course in your basic layer combat mechanics. 3 missions. From here on out you're on your own. So what do you need to know? What did I learn that turned combat from an annoying mess into a dance of death? Firstly, you'll need to know what you've got at your disposal. Your combat roles. As you'd expect, all the classes do have a niche to fill. These are the core tools in your kit: a spanner, hammer, screwdriver. These class descriptions are based around Terror from the Void using the Better Classes mod. However, the majority of the explanation does filter back to the normal game too. Your assault is an adjustable wrench. Reliable, adaptable, your frontline soldier, nothing fancy, but you're going to need a few of them. They're generally fine for damage, they wear average armour, they're best with pockets full of utility items and a secondary weapon in reserve. Their skills are made for mobility, flexibility, and the most efficient use of AP. Using your assault to manage other people's backpacks and equipment for free, looting chests and distributing the riches to those around them, finishing off a weakened enemy, or flat out destroying an unarmed foe to get a free shot when possible, this really lets them shine. They help bring together the other classes in your composition. They compensate for their shortcomings and they support them in the most straightforward manner possible. They share bullets, drop heals, and dump out covering fire. They're a safe pair of hands and a very easy multi-class pick. Every other class benefits from an assault's abilities. The sniper is a pair of needle-nose pliers. Those coming from XCOM may expect the sniper to be the damage dealer, and while it can dish out single high damaging shots, it's designed to disable limbs, exploit weaknesses, remove enemies from combat by crippling them rather than outright killing them. They're generally better suited to a high vantage point, at the back of the map, but they're equally capable of sticking with the squad to make use of handguns in tight situations, and to better ensure that the shots from their rifle don't miss on critical targets, such as breaking a Siren's head to disable mind control, or shooting the pincer off an Arthron that's a little too close for comfort. You wouldn't want too many snipers in your squad, as the high AP cost of their weapon, it makes them a very static target that deals poorly with being overwhelmed. You do, however, always need at least one. Their rifle is invaluable for saving squad mates from halfway across the map with a well-placed shot. The heavy is the tool case. They protect the rest of your tools in combat, wearing the strongest armour with abilities that bolster their defences and play well with retaliatory strikes. Your heavy is also given some of the best shredding tools in the game. They excel at aggressively ripping armour off the largest and strongest enemies, better allowing your other soldiers to deal damage. The heavy gets access to a variety of mounted weaponry, explosives, and a jump pack, giving a large degree of flexibility of when and how to engage. Whilst the armour that they wear is strong, throwing a heavy into the middle of all of the enemies is a terrible idea. Softening up the blob with a grenade launcher from afar, then jumping into a position that will make them expend movement trying to reach you is the way to go. If your squad doesn't have the damage to win nearly all encounters in a single turn, it's likely you'll want a heavy. It's always satisfying to see them stand toe-to-toe with a group of bandits and take less than 20 damage from all of the assault rifle fire combined, safe in their powered suit, waiting for their turn to get some revenge. The Berserker is a hammer. Literally. Run in, donk, hide, hope you don't die. With an array of skills around movement and being able to continue fighting when damaged, a Berserker is a glass cannon melee that's capable of extreme high damage to a single isolated target. The melee weapons they use typically feature a status ailment that works better against specific targets, such as the stun baton being amazing against a Siren, or the bleeding sword working best against a large, chunky target like a Chiron. A Berserker is without doubt the hardest class to use well. The armour is basically paper, and a squad slot is wasted if you spend the entire fight afraid to throw them into combat. However, if you throw them into combat too eagerly, they won't be coming back at all. You have to try and use them as a loud, brutish assassin. They chase down lone enemies and wail on them with a big stick. They end up being more effective than you may think. The Infiltrator is your magnetic pickup tool. The thing that you might not want all the time, but it turns out that having one in reserve is really useful, and they're also insanely fun to use with other magnets. As the stealth mechanic is barely explained in Phoenix Point, it was no surprise to see on the forums and discussions that a lot of players simply didn't get the Infiltrator. With the mod now showing much more clearly how visible or invisible your Infiltrator is, it makes for a better experience. You don't want your Infiltrator anywhere near unsuppressed weapons, opening doors, smashing through windows, standing near breakables. Interacting with anything like this makes noise and gives the enemy a rough target to fire at. Like when a Pandoran makes noise outside of your line of sight, the little red pinging marker. You also certainly don't want an Infiltrator within 3 tiles of an enemy. They'll be instantly uncovered regardless of if they have 100% stealth or not. You want to be keeping clear sightlines and scouting ahead, getting easy flanking shots on enemies that are trying to use full cover. The Infiltrator, as a class, needs to make use of its positioning more than any other, with directional attacks for shock application and limb breaks inflicted by the Infiltrator opening up weak spots. This ability was moved with the better class mod. Sorry Sniper, you've got Inspire instead. Part of the Infiltrator's kit that makes up for its very specific playstyle and at times its somewhat passive nature is spider drones. While the Pandorans have explosive worms, you get explosive spiders. They pack a lot of mobility and best of all, a lot of distraction. Enemies love wasting shots trying to hit the tiny profile on these mines, so they come in very useful for getting a soldier out of harm's way. Whilst a squad wouldn't suffer greatly if they had no Infiltrator, there is something to be said for running an entire squad of Infiltrators. Seeing the enemy have no idea how to deal with it, as long as you can remain silent and undetected, the enemy typically paths to your extract zone and just waits, with no idea of how to deal with you. Feel free to bring a cheeky incendiary grenade or two and have a cookout. The Technician is a roll of duct tape. This class is the closest to a pure support that you have and has the best restoration abilities. Tech arms that can repair vehicles or restore health, a skill which can restore limbs from a broken condition, allowing your soldiers to stay and fight for another round when it counts. They also have some of the strongest kit in the game, in the form of turrets. Whilst a Technician isn't defenceless, wearing reasonably heavy armour and carrying a PDW, they aren't intended to stand and fight on the front line. Instead, they throw turrets to cover themselves and the team as they move up to heal your heavy, assault or berserker units. Turrets are a fantastic distraction and can hold an entire flank as a well-placed pair, leaving your squad to focus on a more dangerous target or areas that require more mobility to traverse and clear sightlines. The Technician can be by far one of the most resource-heavy units to field if used poorly. The tech arms it uses are a huge target and are very easily broken by enemy fire. Whilst the turrets are somewhat trickier to hit with a ranged weapon, they do quickly break if a Pandoran manages to make it into melee. All of these replacements mean that unless you have a very large stockpile of tech and materials on hand, you'll soon find your Technician lacking in the minimum gear requirement to be useful on a mission. This means they have to sit on the bench for a day or two, waiting for you to rebuild your supplies. The Priest is an interchangeable screwdriver. It's part support, part utility, and also capable of high, unmitigated damage. You can build a Priest with one of 3 head mutations, which changes its core ability. The Judgment Head gives you access to Frenzy, a speed boost that makes units immune to panic. This is made for aggression and is widely considered to be the best pick. The Screaming Head is your own version of the Pandoran Psychic Scream. While it isn't as useful against Pandoran threats, it can be used to great effect for clearing buildings of human enemies, being able to hit through walls and floors. Finally, you have the Synod Head, giving access to the Radiant Hope Aura, which restores 2 will points at the start of the turn to the Priest and nearby allies. While at first this may sound underwhelming, it does allow the Priest to maintain, or more frequently use, its psychic abilities. So, this is all just the head abilities, the Priest also gains skills relating to mind control, panic, psychic sense, psychic immunity, and some very strong damage. The quote-unquote downside to the Priest is that they're not specialised in standard weapons. A Priest uses a viral rifle by default, which damages an opponent's will, not their health, causing them to panic and typically be more susceptible to a Priest's influence. This is all to say, how you use a Priest depends entirely on the team that they're working with and how they're built. You can have a Priest which exists entirely to cast Frenzy at the start of a mission, allowing you to win the fight in 2 or 3 turns through sheer violence and speed. You can also build a Priest that exploits mentally weak Pandorans, or those with a broken head, using mind control to turn the numbers in your favour, mitigating the cost of maintaining the mind control through the will point restoration of a Synod head. Or you could have a Priest exist in your team solely to juggle the biggest, baddest target on the map by drowning them in viral damage, constantly making them panic and keeping them unable to use any of their abilities. They're a very fun unit. They're somewhat squishy and near useless if you've blown through all of their willpower reserve, but no other unit offers the disruption or interaction that a Priest can. Who wouldn't want a chance to turn the Pandorans against themselves? So, on the topic of no other unit being able to do what a Priest can, the statement isn't entirely true. There is one more tool in this kit, but reaching into the box, it isn't immediately clear what it is. It can't be defined until you've decided how you want to use it. This is the Mutoid, a mutagen-based vat-grown Pandoran spliced soldier, given the base of any standard class and built into any combination of abilities that you desire. Unlocked from classes you've researched and the Pandorans that you've autopsied, of course. Whilst creating Mutoids as early as possible will allow you to grow familiar with them, and potentially experience their drawbacks, creating more later will allow you to see what other skills they can acquire and rethink your strategy with the ability choices. Arthrons will grant them resistances, mobility, poisonous spits. Tritons play into perception, stealth and regeneration abilities. Sirens unlock psychic abilities and bolster your melee. Chirons give the player access to spawn worms of their own and can greatly disrupt the battlefield with stomps and goo. Scylla unlocks some of the strongest utility and immunities in the game, with Sonic Blast capable of stunning multiple units in a cone every turn. The Acheron offers buff and debuff skills as well as a new opportunity to play with Pandoran soldiers via Resurrect, which summons your own Arthrons or Tritons from corpses to join the fight. As you might expect, with the Mutoid having 5 levels of abilities to choose from, it opens up the possibility of building a soldier up from 28 human skills for the top row, as level 1 is determined by the class choice, and 30 Pandoran skills for the bottom row. I don't even know what kind of math you need to run to work out every unique possible combination, but it's definitely more than a buttload. While some skills are just outright better, numerically or logistically, there are those that synergize well in pairs, and won't appear obvious until you've collected all of the classes and all of the Pandoran skills. There is, of course, nothing stopping you from building a soldier however you see fit. There is a lot, however, to stop you from building the perfect soldier. Firstly, you'll be lacking the best abilities from each class, so no bonus damage from stealth attacks if you wanted to go sneaky, no rage burst to dump an entire clip with a heavy weapon, no recovering AP on successful kills. Not only do you struggle with the drawback of lacking ultimate abilities, but you're also forced to make some tricky choices on certain tiers, while the others may feel entirely wasted. Almost all classes benefit from quick aim or dash, which will likely be fighting for your level 2 top row, similar to how Ready for Action is placed head to head with Master Marksman, or even Weak Spot for some builds. Whilst it may feel like you have a lot of choices on paper, you're unlikely to ever pick Mind Sense over any of the previously mentioned skills. It can be similar with the Pandoran row. Level 1 is practically entirely down to Jump or Paralyze Limb. Double Perception can boost your vision to an absurd level, practically twice the map over. It's overkill. Psychic Scream is insanely situational and expensive. Stomp can be outclassed by a Stun Baton. Goo immunity is very nice, but you could just make a pair of boots for the same effect. And this is the problem with the Mutoid. They aren't particularly expensive per se, but you'll need to have a reliable source of mutagens to keep upgrading, creating, and even healing them. So you'll need to be looting lairs and citadels when they come up, or dedicating some of your other resources to develop a base that is steadily pumping out mutagens with some disciple tech. This is all to say, Mutoids are fun. They're probably not the meta, whatever the meta means in a single player game. You'll be purposefully taking a step back to dedicate a space on the team to these, or you're going to have to create an entirely different team just for Mutoids. Running them, they're harder and more expensive to heal. You'll have a max of 9 skills with only 1 class proficiency. They have no faction skills or background perks, but they're fun. They offer you opportunities to do nonsense that no other class can. You can roll into a mission with 8 Mutoids that all throw fireworms, knowing that enemies simply can't deal with them all, and then start the barbecue. Do you want to take down a spawnery? Really easy? Stand halfway across the map and just lob worms at it. Some of them will eventually land. Detonate them, and then the burn damage will make all of the egg sacs burst at the same time. All you need is a few more turns and it'll bleed to death, while you twiddle your thumbs and watch the inferno just blaze around you. Would you like to lock off a spawn point? Simply put a worm on top of it. As long as the Pandorans have 1 unblocked spawn point available, you can force them to only appear at that site. Fish in a barrel. And all of this is just 1 ability. You still have all kinds of insanity. Goo bombs, resurrection, limb paralysis. You can hit a siren in the head with paralyzed limb to drop their maximum will points to around 5. Simply use a priest to mind control them. When the paralyzed limb wears off the next turn, you have a perfectly healthy siren of your own. You can just go on a tear with it. You'll likely find all of this stuff out by experimenting and messing with Mutoids, but it's dangerous. I already mentioned how Phoenix Point punishes players and places the burden of fault firmly at your feet. Mutoids are this dialed up to 11. Make a bad skill choice? Your fault. An interaction didn't work how you were hoping? Your fault. You don't know until you try, but if the result of the experiment is negative, it feels awful. These guys aren't a cheap experiment either. In terms of expenses, all soldiers need serious investment to grow. Mutoids have the option of bypassing this by spending mutagens to grow from 0 to hero. They're great in a pinch as you can have a stat cap soldier right out of the gate for a bunch of mutagens. Human soldiers, on the other hand, need time and combat experience, or a lot of help from the exclusive shared point pool. In combat, all soldiers will earn experience, which in turn determines their level, capped at 7. Experience from a mission is fixed, regardless of how many enemies you kill. The experience is divided between soldiers depending on what their deemed contribution was. Did they deal a lot of damage? Did they use a lot of items, heal their allies, etc.? Objectives may offer more or less experience at the end of a mission, such as how many of the citizens survived a Haven assault, but this experience cannot be increased outside of its predetermined maximum. There is simply no way to farm a single mission in Phoenix Point to instantly cap your soldiers. This means the best way to grind is to get in and get out of missions as quickly and safely as possible. Your soldiers will be less fatigued and earning the other, more important resource much faster. These are your skill points, or SP, which are spent to increase a soldier's core stats of strength, willpower and speed, as well as being used to purchase abilities which have been unlocked via levelling up. Levelling up only unlocks the potential to buy an ability, so a high level soldier isn't guaranteed to have a full array of skills. Whilst experience from a mission is divided between soldiers, all soldiers earn SP equally. This means that a team of 5 will earn more individual experience and level much faster, whilst a team of 8 will level slowly but gain more skill points in the process and typically hit level 7 with a higher likelihood of having all of their abilities unlocked and better stats. Personally, I feel skill points are far more important than rushing to max level. A max level soldier may have access to their top tier abilities, but they won't be able to afford all of them. So, you'll pick and choose the best and be unlikely to have many points left for the stats to use them without placing yourself at a high risk of being caught out of position due to poor mobility, at a risk of panic because of low willpower and costly abilities, or worse, only 1 or 2 solid hits away from death at any moment. Compare this to a high-statted, low-level soldier. They can't do much outside of run and gun, but they can travel further, take more hits, and they're never really going to have to worry about panic. These soldiers aren't going to do anything fancy in a fight, but they can clear up the weaker enemies and help the others who are in a bind. Stick them close to your experienced crew and have them picking up the scraps, fixing the odd missed bullet or two, throwing the grenades for the team. They soon level up, and the points spent on stats will have ensured that they can survive to see another day. I should mention that there is another stat that you do need to manage for all of your soldiers: fatigue. It's expended when on a mission at 1 point per turn. Having a limb disabled whilst using Terror from the Void will fully exhaust a soldier, as will augmenting or mutating a soldier. Fatigue can be recovered by allowing soldiers R&R time at a base, even if they're still stationed within the aircraft while doing so, or by using a FAR module in their aircraft, which will passively recover fatigue at a slow rate. This means that finishing missions quickly and safely saves you a lot of time by not needing to return to base to rest. You can go into combat when soldiers begin to get low levels of fatigue. However, this effect lowers their maximum AP and can render soldiers near useless, such as dropping a sniper to 3 AP max. This means they can no longer move and shoot without help. Avoid fatigue penalties as much as possible. There is another pool of points that soldiers can draw from, the exclusive shared pool. These are PP, or Phoenix points. Oh, you really have to call it PP. It's called PP in the game, alright. While all soldiers participating in a mission earn individual SP, they also add some PP to the global pool. And now you've said PP in the pool. These points can be used to help pay for a new ability if a soldier is a little short with their own SP, or simply dumped into an entirely different soldier who has never seen combat but desperately needs some points in speed and strength to survive the next base defense. In regards to stat points, and also generally speaking, speed is key in Phoenix Point. Mobility not only saves your life, it saves you AP in combat. A faster soldier can move further for a single AP. This gives you more room to maneuver, better positions to shoot from, and most importantly, lets you move far enough to save others if they've taken a bad hit. I always max speed on a soldier before spending points on any other stat. Whilst this does make for some very fragile operatives, being able to avoid taking a hit entirely is better than having the strength to be punched in the face a few times because you skipped training cardio. In this game, you want to be like Ali, not Rocky. Then, I'd typically focus on getting anywhere between 25 and 30 strength next, depending on the class, with the higher strength on the front line. Whilst you can be careful, damage is an inevitability. It's simply sometimes unavoidable due to overwhelming odds, terrain, or status effects such as goo. Some classes in the game also thrive on retaliation, such as return fire or bloodlust bonuses from being hurt. If you want people to be able to take a hit and then make use of their abilities, they've got to be able to stand up afterwards. A higher HP pool will allow you to do that. Willpower is the final stat that I normally focus on. Whilst it may be tempting to dump points into this to allow you to use all of your special abilities more often, it is better to get into the habit of managing your will points carefully, as it'll also keep your soldiers from panicking. You want to be remembering things like getting kill shots with your inspiring sniper, claiming the will restoration point after you've spent your points for abilities that round so you don't get any overflow or wasted potential. Maybe consider not using your dash or quick aim if actually it's going to make no difference by the end of the turn. If you're going to be waiting for a sniper to make it to the extract point and the assault has just dashed twice, only now to have to sit and wait at the extract point, 6 will points poorer, twiddling their thumbs, maybe those points could have been better spent elsewhere? Experiment with how you run your turns. You can easily break up actions over the whole squad. Soldiers don't need to use all of their AP in back-to-back decisions, so take your scouting moves, use the shots that feel the most likely to hit, survey what is left and replan if necessary. Your plan is going to need to be as flexible as possible in Phoenix Point. Trying new things with your soldiers and equipment when it is safer to do so means you have the knowledge ready to go when it matters. If there's only one Pandoran left on the map, okay, let's take the time to break down its mobility. Let's figure out its weak spots, its effective range. Is there any status effect that might be stronger against this foe? Everything in Phoenix Point has at least one solid weakness. Finding it will stay with you and make every subsequent encounter that much easier. And with experimentation in mind, Mutoids aren't the only class that can use the abilities of others. Every class in Phoenix Point has the option of multiclassing, and with Terror from the Void and the integration of better classes, order matters. The primary class and faction plays the biggest role here. Soldiers will all have 3 rows of abilities. The top row is determined by the primary class from level 1 to 7. The middle row is determined by faction origin at level 2 and 7. Primary class at level 3 and 6. Random background perks at level 1 and 5. And another random class weapon specialization at level 4. This was all a lot of numbers, right? The bottom row is determined by the secondary class, or your multiclass, if you will. What this means is that a Phoenix Origin sniper that multiclassed into an assault will be different to a new Jericho assault that multiclassed into a sniper. As well as the matter of RNG with background perks, you'll also have a soldier with different second row primaries and origin perks. In this case, the Phoenix sniper will have 50% better overwatch accuracy, plus 2 to all main stats, a 10% bonus to accuracy, better perception, and the gunslinger and killzone skill, which pairs beautifully with increased overwatch accuracy. In comparison, the new Jericho quote-unquote sniper will have takedown, which is an improved melee skill, Punisher, which lowers enemy will points by an additional 2 upon kill, and the quarterback passive for move speed and grenade range, as well as aimed burst, which allows for a double shot from an assault rifle with increased accuracy. While both of these classes do indeed use a sniper assault combo, one is designed to deal heavy damage from a very long range with deadly overwatch. The other is a highly accurate assault that wants to get to medium range to deliver killing blows, shattering the enemy resolve. Whilst nearly all of this nuance is lost in the base game, as classes are a lot flatter and they don't have the depth of the middle row skills, it does still hold the same risk, the choice of multiclassing. Some classes simply do not bond well together, others are practically made to be used in unison. The most obvious mention and the easiest go-to is a Sniper Infiltrator. If you can get an augmentation to make your sniper rifle shots silenced, you can happily sit at the back of a fight, dealing an extra 50% damage with every single shot. Other combos may not be so immediately obvious, like a Heavy Infiltrator, the class that is the loudest, slowest, most obvious unit on the field, paired with an Infiltrator? Of course, you just put it in sneaky armour. That 50% damage bonus can then be applied to, say, a grenade launcher, and the Heavy just so happens to have a skill called Boom Blast, which increases range by 50% on explosives and lowers the AP cost by 1. Pair them with a couple of assaults giving them bonus AP and watch the fireworks fly. Your explosions will tear Pandoras to shreds across the entire map. You don't need to stay hidden for long, just long enough to paint the map red. So still looking at the Infiltrator, that damage bonus, wouldn't it be amazing on a Berserker? Melee already hits like a truck, so a 50% bonus on that would be stellar, and the hammer has to be silent as well. Except, even with 100% on your stealth stat, you're still going to be revealed when you get into melee range, and you will never benefit from that bonus. Not to mention how poorly all of the other skills of these classes synergize. The worst thing here is that you might have tried this combination on your favourite Berserker, or on your favourite Infiltrator, with the dream of a ninja who sneaks in, turns into a flurry of blades and viscera, and vanishes into the night, only to be left sorely, sorely disappointed. Again, Phoenix Point punishes you for experimenting, but you don't know how this works until you've tried it, or without watching some needlessly detailed media on the game beforehand. All of this can leave you terrified to even try multiclassing, for fear of ruining a soldier. Not only is it needlessly expensive, costing an extra 50 points to unlock your second class, and then requiring more points to unlock the abilities, but now you always have that fear in the back of your mind when you use this soldier. This soldier has had more points spent on them. This soldier is special. I sure hope this soldier doesn't get shot in the face by a Triton marksman on the edge of the map that I never saw, and I especially hope that this soldier isn't then bonked in the face by a Scylla that jumped halfway across the map to get into melee. Sure would suck if this soldier I'd invested so much into was killed. You've likely been punished for experimenting already, so why not just stick to what you know? The sniper is fine as a sniper after all. It's a shame, isn't it, to feel almost scared to use these mechanics? I'm here to tell you that I didn't get to the point of playing 1,000 hours in this game without making a pretty stellar memorial wall each and every campaign that I tried something new. The important takeaway from this, and I cannot stress this enough, is it fun to play this game optimally. You're handed this toolbox, this fantastic array of options, these nonsense skills that range from I have never found a reliable use for this in all of my playtime, to I can't wait to unlock this every campaign, it's just so stupid. Do you want to play this game to a degree that you aren't allowed to mess around? To try making a magnetic hammer or a pair of screwdriving pliers? To go for a poison only squad, a mind control squad, as many augments, mutations and weird combinations as you can think of. After 1,000 hours of play, doing restricted challenge runs, legend runs, no death runs, I just put this game on hero and I just don't care about legend anymore. I want to laugh, I want to run stupid teams, I want to have crazy moments. I don't want to sweat out every single mission, make every point and every penny count. You should too. As a tactics game, just leave your ego at the door with Phoenix Point. This game simply doesn't do a good job of letting you learn through mistakes. You need to be able to make the mistakes and not suffer greatly for them. Once you've conducted your scientific experiments, found your groove and got a hang of the gameplay, then you can push for higher difficulties. Even then, it simply isn't necessary unless you feel you have something to prove to yourself, which is on you, nobody else. So, these are your tools, including the stats that make them stronger or weaker. Tools by themselves are great, but you need materials to work with. Nails, screws, bolts. It's time to talk about gear, and how gear works in Phoenix Point. I previously mentioned there were over a dozen weapon types. While some types of weapon may only actually offer one piece of equipment, others have quite a range. The important thing to mention at the start of this section is that classes can use any weapon and any armour that they choose, but lacking proficiency with a weapon will inflict a negative modifier, reducing the effective range and by extension the accuracy of the weapon by 50%, or in the case of melee, giving you the risk of simply fumbling your attack, causing you to miss the swing entirely. Lacking proficiency with heavy armour will render the included jump jet or any mounted weaponry unusable, while still providing you with the bonus armour. Rather than going into every specific weapon or class, it might be easier to lay the groundwork for damage types and status ailments that can be inflicted, as these are shared over multiple weapons and will allow you to better understand the information thrown at you by Phoenix Point. I'll also cover how health pools for soldiers work, as these are extremely relevant to specific damage types. Base damage is simple. It's a raw number that's reduced when hitting armour. So how does that work in Phoenix Point? We will use the most basic Pandoran for this example. Let's ignore its max HP and any additional effects that the weapon may deal to begin with. This is just a breakdown on an unevolved Arthron for base damage. It has 10 armour on its torso and head and absolutely no armour on its arms and legs. Its body is broken into 6 limbs and you're given the possibility of shooting it directly in its weapon, the pincer, which has 20 armour. The standard Phoenix assault rifle, the Ares, hits for 30 damage per round and fires 6 rounds per burst, meaning landing every bullet on the leg would deal 180 damage to the Arthron. If you hit it 6 times in the torso, you would only do 120. Shooting it directly in its weapon, the pincer, only does 60 damage even if you hit every shot, but breaking the arm that the pincer is attached to would have disabled its weapon and caused 120 more damage than shooting the weapon directly. I know, this is all a lot of numbers, but this is one of the most important aspects of Phoenix Point's combat. Locational damage and manual aiming. If a limb has a maximum of 50 health, like the Arthron arms, that means that it only needs to be hit by 2 rounds from this assault rifle burst to break. Any damage applied to a limb also applies to the total HP of the unit. So in this case, if the Arthron has 110 HP max, Did shooting the arm stop at 50 damage because the HP of that limb was already reduced to 0? No. If you land 3 of your 6 rounds on the Arthron's arm, it would be left at 20 out of 110 max HP, not counting any bleeding yet. We'll cover that later. So while aiming for centre mass is more likely to hit with every round, getting a flank to shoot into the side of the target is more likely to hit those lovely weak arms, with stray shots still likely to hit the torso. Or you could always do the old faithful, put the barrel of your gun directly on the weakest limb and pull the trigger until the red mist clears. Picking your shots at the start of the game is easy. Most of the early Pandoran enemies will die in 1 or 2 bursts if they successfully hit them. Later in the game you need to decide if you're shooting at an enemy to lower their overall HP, trying to kill them, or if you're shooting a specific limb which may potentially do less max damage but might reduce their mobility or remove a dangerous ability. In the case of the Arthrons, by late game they sport a thick chitin plate, they have shields, a far more deadly pincer, but their weakness is still that arm that connects the pincer to their body. The tankiest version, a Shield Bearer Prime, sits at 440 max HP. It can be entirely disabled by dealing 70 damage to its right arm. It removes its offensive capability and means it has to flee the map. I could put a whole section in here about trick shots, with rounds capable of penetrating body parts to pass the excess damage into the limb behind it, being able to line up shots to kill a target, which means the remaining burst will hit another target that was stuck behind them, but this is all situational at best and something you need to get a feel for with time, not necessarily something to rely on. Just bear in mind, bullet penetration does matter. Walls aren't solid in Phoenix Point. If you want a new path, you can make it yourself using a high damage weapon, manually aimed and fired directly at a wall. So that was basic damage, but it skipped a couple of damage types for the sake of simplicity. So, still using this example, let's first introduce Shred. Shred damage only affects armour, and as its name implies, it shreds it. The Ares rifle does 1 shred per round, so potentially 6 shred per burst. Shred deals no additional damage to unarmoured body parts. It simply allows armoured body parts to be better damaged by subsequent shots. So let's say you're shooting the Arthron's torso this time. It has 10 armour. I previously stated that if every bullet hit, you would hit for 120 damage. Taking Shred into account, you actually deal 135. The first shot hits for 20, the second for 21, the third for 22, and so on. Whilst yes, for this example the Arthron is toast, even without the armour helping it. Learning this stacking math is very important to avoid putting an assault in a compromising situation by overestimating your damage. Equally, have a think before writing off certain limb shots. The game is balanced so specifically that some shredding weapons will just break a limb if every round hits. The final damage type mentioned with this example is Bleed. Bleed can be applied by breaking limbs or by specific slashing weapons, such as the Disciple Sword or the Siren Arm Blades. Bleed ticks at the start of the turn and deals its damage directly to the main HP pool. Whilst Bleed can be applied to a limb, it doesn't lower limb HP. Using a medkit will staunch bleeding and remove the dot, regardless of severity. This will not, however, recover a limb that was broken to cause the bleed. Whilst we're talking dots and Arthrons, Poison is the next type of status. Arthrons are likely to be the first enemy that you'll encounter with this damage type. It'll be an ability tied to their head, Spit Poison. Now, poison damage must be applied with a source of direct damage. There are no pure sources of poison damage in the game. They all come tied with blast, like poison worms, or direct damage, like poison spit. If you can mitigate the damage entirely from the attack with armour, you completely nullify the poison application. This is why you may notice that your heavy can sit and soak a couple of explosions from poison worms before they start to succumb to the toxic fumes, because those blasts are also shredding you a little each turn too, making you more vulnerable to the next, when that blast damage can finally bypass the armour and apply the poison dot. Poison can stack, and will tick at the start of the turn, exactly like a bleed, but unlike a bleed, Every time poison ticks, it lowers its own value by 10. So, if you get hit with, say, a poison spit, you'll take 60 on the first turn, 50 on the second, and so on. Using a medkit removes all poison from a soldier. Poison has been revamped with Terror from the Void and has an additional bonus, causing the target to tremble violently when under its effect, reducing the accuracy of ranged attacks by 50%. This is amazing to cripple snipers and, more interestingly, Chirons, as it causes their worm launches to scatter so far across the map that many land out of bounds. It's worth considering keeping poison options available, if not for the damage, but for this debuff instead. Now, I used a word when talking about the poison worms there. Blast. This is another damage type that is typically tied to explosives. Blast damage is suited towards weakening or breaking multiple limbs simultaneously, generally doing less damage to the max HP pool compared to direct damage, whilst being able to hit every limb caught in the explosion at once. So even though you could hit 6 limbs for 50 damage, a grenade won't deal 300 damage to max HP, it'll deal 50. Direction, cover and sightlines do matter for explosions. A grenade thrown in front of an Arthron with its shield up is unlikely to hit many limbs with the damage from fragmentation, but landing it perfectly in that sweet spot they leave open on their right side of the body will usually hit almost every single part. Blast damage will be affected by armour, exactly the same as direct damage. Blast damage is also a fantastic tool when you can hit and weaken multiple small targets, or a lot of limbs on a large target to soften them up. And while explosives can be expensive, they sure do make your job easy. Grenades and worms do come in a few flavours, so let's cover these next. First up is my personal favourite in Phoenix Point, the spicy one, fire damage. Whether it's worms, grenades or a flamethrower, I can't get enough of burning maps in Phoenix Point. Fire damage in itself is one of the 2 more complicated formulas in Phoenix Point, with the second one coming up next, but don't worry, we're going to do a simplified version. Fire is always applied with another type of damage, just like poison. Blast for grenades and worms, direct for flamethrower, simple. But unlike poison, fire doesn't give a crap if you mitigate the damage that it's tied to, because it's going to set your ass on fire and spread napalm beneath your feet. The real threat from fire damage is having to move through it, as the damage ticks every single step. How does fire deal damage though? Firstly, I mentioned it's entirely mitigated by armour. High armour allows you to walk through fire without any fear, if you can fight the pathfinding AI to do it anyway. Like poison, fire ticks down by 10 every turn it's on the target, so that first tick is when it matters most, that big 40. This also applies to the fire left on the floor, so most classes will be fine to walk through it with relative safety after a couple of turns. All of this sounds a little lackluster on paper. 40 damage? And the enemy has to move through it for it to really do that much? Now, consider that fire works like blast damage. It ticks on limb health. It does individual math against every limb compared to its armour. Fire doesn't exist as a status to do damage to the max HP pool. It exists to break every single limb that an enemy has. With the more limbs, the better. Tritons simply crumble. Arthrons with fast legs will fall to pieces, crossing an inferno, trying to get to you just because of how fast the damage ticks. Any enemy with a footprint bigger than 1 tile is going to have an absolute nightmare escaping from the area of denial. Fire is devastating. Pandorans charge through choke points bathed in flame and just don't come out the other side. Enemies with sneaky abilities like Pain Chameleon suddenly don't seem very dangerous when they're forced to disappear and walk through fire, killing themselves. Can you tell that I really like this damage type? You should too. Get out there and purify everything you see. It's the tits. Okay, back on track. That other flavour of worm is sour. Like Warhead sour. Acid. Without a doubt, acid has the most complicated formula, and I'm not even sure it was intended to work the way that it sometimes does. It may be bugged. It may have been patched for all I know since time of recording. Acid damage has a critical mass potential that you will see skyrocket, but it's a weird, potentially even broken math that shouldn't work the way that it does. Let's first focus on how acid should work. Acid is shred on steroids. If you're imagining the xenomorph blood from the Alien franchise, you're on the right track. Like fire and poison, acid is always tied to another damage type, but it's closer to fire in that it doesn't care if the damage is applied or not. It'll still work as a status and stick to the target. Acid is applied solely to limbs and will tick at the start of the turn, always hitting the armour first. Regardless of how much higher the acid value is than the armour, it will always be initially blocked by armour. You could drop a rage burst with a heavy using the acid cannon, dumping 2,000 acid onto a single limb with just 20 armour. It doesn't matter, you're only doing 20 damage to that armour for the first turn. The second turn is when acid matters, or if you manage to apply it to a limb that has absolutely no armour to begin with. With nothing to mitigate acid damage, it deals that much damage to the target, not meaning just limb damage. The max HP will also take that damage. You can't use a medkit to remove acid. It's easily stackable, impossible to ignore. It's a time bomb. Like poison, it ticks down by 10 every turn, but unlike poison, the damage potential of acid is absurd. The sweet spot seems to be applying as much acid as possible to a limb before it does the tick that will cause the limb to break. It makes the math a little hazy to figure out, but from what I worked out with my stream chat around 2 years ago, I've re-recorded this example because the example was too small in scale. It didn't really make sense. You mainly notice this acid math when it's applied to something huge, like a Scylla. So if you take the Xenagos for example, the Xenagos head has 60 armour and 500 HP. The Scylla as a whole has 3,900 HP, a massive pool. So, you break the armour off the head, and let's say that you apply 1,000 acid to the head. You know that it's going to break the head, and you know that the acid is also going to hit the main HP pool. You would expect there to be 2,000 damage, taken away from the HP pool of 3,900. What actually happens is that when the head is broken, the max HP of the enemy is lowered. What seems to happen is that the lowered max HP is applied first, and then both of the damages tick. What you end up with is kind of cheating a little bit of extra damage in with acid. This is as best as we could work it out on stream anyway. It could still be entirely wrong, it might be working exactly as intended. All I know is, however much acid said it was going to tick for, if it broke a limb, it always seemed to tick for more. Admittedly, I haven't tried this in a while. It may have been patched, as relying on this weird broken math was shaky ground at best, and it did lose me a few soldiers with bad calculation. But the main takeaway should be, acid is polite enough to wait for its turn until the armour is gone, then it turns somebody into a puddle. It isn't made for every enemy, but it's fantastic for huge, hulking enemies that will stick around long enough to let it rip. That was a lot. So, let's do something simple. Shock damage. In all honesty, it's probably easier to think of shock as stun. It's usually applied with high impact weaponry such as melee or heavy slugs. To work out if shock will work, take the armour of the body part that it hit, subtract it from the shock value, and then compare it to the general HP of the unit. If the shock value is higher, the target is dazed, resulting in them being unable to use abilities, halving their accuracy, and reducing them to 1 AP for the next turn. This status is incredibly useful for breaking mind control by dazing the caster, or for locking enemies out of using their high AP cost weapons, like sniper rifles and heavy cannons. Shock unfortunately doesn't stack, so one massive hit of shock is much better than multiple small applications. Do you want something practically the same as shock damage? Sure, sonic damage, but this doesn't cause you to drop all of your rings when you get hit by it. It has exactly the same effect as shock, only it checks against will points rather than max general HP, and it isn't tied to any direct damage when used. very few weapons and abilities ever use sonic damage in the game. However, one of the ones that does, Sonic Blast, is available for your Mutoids after you've killed a Scylla. It's one of the most powerful lockdown tools in the game, especially against human enemies. How about locking something down permanently? Paralysis is your answer here. This damage type is required to complete certain research in the game, as you need to bring enemies home alive. Working the same as a poison application, it requires the damage that it's tied to be able to make it through the armour to apply. Paralysis is typically tied with low damage, high penetration weapons. If you divide the enemy's HP by 10, yep, more math, Phoenix Point, that'll let you know how much paralysis is required to fully sedate them, with the target losing 1, 2 and 3 AP as it reaches 25, 50 and 75% of that value respectively. This means that you can entirely negate enemies that need to use large amounts of AP to fire their weapon by applying a half stack of paralysis. This is especially powerful against Triton snipers and Chirons. You can even use it to keep a Siren at arm's length, knowing that they need 2 AP to use their melee and always have to move to get into melee range. Just be careful that they aren't left to freely mind control or panic your soldiers. Paralysis does tick down every turn, so you'll want to over apply it if there are a lot of turns left in combat and the target is close to the threshold. You'll need to research better technology to have better tools to remove paralysis from your own soldiers. While it isn't a deadly threat, having your squad's AP crippled from just a few paralysis applications is incredibly dangerous. Do not underestimate how hard it is to come back from only a couple of shots of paralysis landing on your team, especially on a mission that requires reaching an extraction point. How about a damage made for a very specific enemy type? EMP Damage. While it's an obvious counter for the pure, its damage profile is similar to Sonic, or rather, its lack of a damage profile. It deals 0 direct damage and only applies its unique EMP effect, which is bizarrely mitigated by armour. So the pure use electrically shielded ballistic plates, I guess. The EMP effect is only available in a grenade, so it works the same as blast damage, just solely to cybernetic limbs, turrets or vehicles. The EMP effect will also disable whatever parts it deals damage to for 1 turn, giving you an easy way to hobble those pesky cyborgs. While it won't daze a target, it's highly likely to hit both legs and 1 arm due to the nature of the splash sphere, rendering them unable to move or use a 2-handed weapon. Let's stay on the topic of obscure damage types. We've got psychic damage now. This naming makes it sound akin to a standard or blast damage. However, psychic damage is actually willpower damage. This is a value tied to Psychic Scream that makes your soldiers panic if it drops them below 0 will. Very few abilities do psychic damage. Even more strangely is that psychic abilities that do actual damage, like a damaging psychic attack such as Mind Crush, they don't deal psychic damage. They deal flat damage that can't be mitigated. I never said any of these things make sense. And if you like the naming convention of psychic damage, wait until you hear about viral damage. Not to be confused with Virophage Damage. We can do that next. Viral damage is a dot that hits willpower, dealing absolutely no damage to the health of the target. It's poison for the mind if you prefer. The Andrew Tate of Phoenix Point. It's applied exactly the same as poison damage too. The shot that carries the viral load is required to deal at least 1 standard damage to the target for the virus to apply, so high armour can entirely negate virus damage. Virus ticks at the start of every turn, lowering its value by 1 every time it ticks, so if it successfully drops the target's will points below 0, they'll panic. There is a fantastic interaction with panic that viral damage makes possible. If an enemy panics on your turn through losing will because their allies died or because you used a Psychic Scream, they will recover on their first turn and be back into the fight on their second. But if you can make them panic from virus damage, it ticks at the start of their turn. They instead panic immediately. Then they spend the second turn using recover, then they get back into the fight on the 3rd. If you manage your stacks and timings correctly, you can juggle enemies and operate with 0 risk for a couple of turns. Without the Synedrian research, virus isn't reduced when you use a medkit. However, all soldiers have a skill called Recover by default, which, thanks to Terror from the Void, removes half of the virus stack and provides immunity to panic after using it. This counts for enemies too though, so it isn't as easy to keep ludicrous amounts of virus on large targets anymore. I mentioned Virophage damage when talking about viral. Virophage is very late game. It's a highly exclusive damage type. It's a bioweapon, specifically tailored to harm life forms that contain Pandoran biology. Virophage is again always tied to a standard damage of some sort, blast or bullet, but it's impossible to mitigate. Virophage will always deal the damage it states to the limb or limbs that it hits, outside of any reductions done to the standard or blast damage caused alongside it. As the Virophage damage is designed to damage Pandoran biology, it works on mutated limbs as well, absolutely destroying the Disciples of Anu and the Forsaken in combat. It might not be entirely within the rules of the Geneva Convention, but if you use it before they have the time to amend the documentation, you should be fine. The final damage type isn't really damage, it's a booster for certain weapons. Pierce. It helps weapons ignore a set amount of armour with every shot, usually at the cost of a lower damage output or by removing the shred effect that the weapon of that type previously had. For most weapons that use Pierce, they'll have a counterpart that offers another bonus, likely leading to a higher damage potential, with Pierce always being the safer option as it's more rounded and generally useful. So that is what you have to work with. Quite a range of effects. There is no specific go-to damage or status for every enemy, as Pandorans evolve in varied paths. Fire will be devastating against Pain Chameleon torso based Tritons, but the Maniac type, especially in Alpha, rocks far more HP and armour, is able to safely walk through your incendiary hazard and use its regeneration torso to shrug the damage off. What you need to ensure is a clear direction in the team that you build. Pick 3 or 4 of these main options and make sure that the classes support these goals. While having access to every damage type over an entire team may seem tempting, you end up in situations that make some units near useless and another unable to deal with all of the targets that they are supposed to deal with. A good example is a willpower offense based team. If you're wanting to lean into breaking the enemy's spirit, you'll need snipers to inflict headshots and lower will pools, priests to apply virus, mind control or panic enemies, assaults to give others extra AP, clean up weaker targets and support the team, and you could even add a berserker with a virus mace to really cause some panic. What you're not going to add into this team is infiltrators or technicians. You don't need to scout with an infiltrator if you can steal a Pandoran unit and get them to do it for you. Equally, you want enemies running around in fear, so turrets won't be able to get the return fire opportunities and are likely to keep losing sightlines on targets. And just be aware that, as I said, you want more than one option for this team. The assaults will need grenades for shred or incendiary, and possibly a shotgun for high damage output. Maybe keep a stun baton on the berserker to tie up any enemies that get too close for comfort so you can leave them dazed. If you're bringing a priest, what head do they have? If you have 2 priests, do the head mutations work together, or are they simply overlapping and doing the same thing? Not every team needs to be perfect and equipped with exact loadouts, but you should go in with a feeling of what your strengths and weaknesses are. This team would struggle with long-ranged enemies, snipers, Chirons. You need to cover a lot of ground to get close enough to do the damage that you want. So how can you counter it with this team? You've got a few options. The worms that the Chirons throw will be highly vulnerable to Mind Crush, or even Mind Control. You can use them yourself to blow up any nearby targets, or just move them out of the way and dispose of them. Assault primaries have the quarterback trait, which makes it easy for you to really hook an explosive, maiming or flushing out sniper Pandorans from fantastic distance. With Mind Sense on a priest, you can safely scout buildings when hugging walls, allowing you to stay out of sight from snipers and not put yourself too close to danger either. Whilst the solutions aren't perfect, you do have something. making it all the more likely that this team will not only make it home safely, but come together as a group that you can get more familiar with, eventually becoming second nature when you drop into a mission. This is their goal. This is how they achieve it. These are their weaknesses. This is how we mitigate them. So take the time to experiment, pick your primary damage, add support for it, and cover what it'd struggle with. Doing everything with one team is impossible. Doing one thing very well with every team is the aim. Part 2.22 Fishy Boys. You cannot crab Vance. As I've mentioned a lot of Pandorans by name already, it's time to go over the enemies you'll be facing, what evolutions you can expect them to take, and why you should or shouldn't fear them. Arthrons. These guys are what you'll likely first encounter and will feel most comfortable to approach. They make sense in how they adapt and have clearly defined limbs that are very clear in what they provide to the unit. Big claw, stay away. Big gross spitty face, stay a little further away. Gun, stay behind a wall. Grenade launcher, don't group up. It really is that simple for the most part. Break the arm of the weapon that you don't like the look of and it'll fall off, or shoot them in the face if you don't want them spitting on you. If it only has a claw, you can break a leg and it'll cripple its movement, or create a fire hazard between you and it, so it needs to move through a high damage area to reach you. The AI is insane enough that it'll likely try this and die in the process. While some varieties come in with hulking carapaces, plated legs, enormous shields, there is never a single one that can withstand a single sniper round to the right arm, that elbow that they poke towards the sky so proudly. Hit that, watch their primary weapon fall off, profit. From then on, it's up to you how you deal with their remaining threats, if there are any. If it's a shield bearer, you can ignore it, it'll leave the field out of shame. Just be aware that if you want to damage the unit, shooting the weapon on the end of its arm only damages the weapon, whereas shooting the arm itself also hurts the Arthron. I know they're organic weapons, so it feels like it should damage them, but I don't make these rules, I just explain them. Tritons. The first few times you deal with Tritons feels a little confusing. Early Arthrons die in one good burst, or even a single well-placed bullet. The most basic Triton, the Strangler, has enough health and armour to withstand a full burst from an assault. They'll need a good couple of hits to down them, and if you leave them up and injured, they get to lifesteal with their upper arms. You should take note that Tritons have a much more annoying profile to hit than an Arthron. Tritons hunch. They lurch and sway quite dramatically in their idle animation. You can use this to your advantage if you time your shots correctly. It allows you to catch them when they lean out of cover, or this might make you miss your shot entirely. If you aim for their arm and click fire just as they start to move, they'll bolt to the side, causing your bullets to go wide. Spend the time getting a good feel for their pattern. You'll thank yourself for it more than just a few times. Whereas Arthrons evolve for both melee and ranged, Tritons do better at longer distances. They steal and scavenge tech from the factions and then field it against you. They use sniper rifles, assault rifles, virus rifles, pistols, shotguns, and it can be just as annoying as it sounds. Those fancy shredding shotguns that the Disciples of Anu just developed look really cool, right? It's going to be a shame that the first time you see one, it's in the hands of these gits, charging towards your squishiest soldier and turning their already paper-thin armour into confetti. Tritons have two main branches of evolution, Pain Chameleon and Regeneration. Regeneration speaks for itself. If the torso isn't broken, they regenerate their limbs every turn, meaning that breaking their arm to stop them pulling the trigger isn't an option until you've already done a significant amount of damage to their far more armoured and healthy torso. Pain Chameleon allows the Triton to go into an advanced state of invisibility upon taking damage, relocating to a nearby tile. They are forced to execute this move when the ability is triggered, so fire's the best way to make it happen. They sure do love killing themselves. If you don't have Incendiary and you want to cheese it just a little bit, there are a couple of clues to find them after this vanish. The lighting around the unit can sometimes give away the direction they've moved, as you'll see a shimmer on the floor, hinting at where they moved to. If you'd like a more exact hint, mouse over the tiles where you think they may be. If the movement outline disappears, this tile is occupied, which means you found them. You can also use this to look over walls into the fog of war to find large targets. It's definitely not intended to work this way, but I consider it a tactical genius on the part of the players, so well done for utilising it. For the most of the game, you'll want a shotgun to deal with Tritons, preferably the Iconoclast on the assault. This allows you to get in close and fire 350 damage worth of buckshot at their weakest limb, most likely one of their gangly arms. It'll be a while before they evolve their armour plating, by which point you should have more than enough explosives to soften them up first anyway. Just make sure you have the damage to drop them before you get in too close. Tritons are headshot gods, and punish you for leaving them anything remotely close to a clear shot. Umbra. These are a rare sight in Vanilla Phoenix Point, but far more commonplace, with the stats to match, in Terror from the Void. Void-touched enemies have a chance of spawning an Umbra version of an Arthron or a Triton, with corrupt enemies in Vanilla having a 100% spawn chance. Fortunately, Umbra versions of other Pandorans don't exist. Umbra lack limbs and are simply a large mass of organic, tar-like matter that will try everything they can to attack soldiers in melee. They're the closest enemy to a literal bullet sponge. They can't be panicked, they can't be broken, they can't be disabled. You just need to dump rounds into them until they cease to exist. They can be brought down by tactically placing overwatches over their spawning pool, giving you some quick, easy shots as soon as they start their movement. Or they can be negated entirely by killing the void-touched enemy in a patch of fire, blocking the Umbra spawn, or by knocking the corpse off a ledge or edge of the map, also negating the spawn. While the Umbra in Vanilla were scarier, boasting a much larger HP pool, they are far more frequent in missions from Terror from the Void, and require you to manage the order in which you deal with Pandorans, ensuring you don't simply swap the threat from an Arthron to an Arthron Umbra. It may be worth considering keeping Paralysis as an option for the void-touched enemies to lock them down entirely in a fight, avoiding having to spawn the Umbra and taking home a captive too. You may also want Time Bleed or Poison Damage so that Arthrons or Tritons die on the start of their turn when the summoning pool is created. This gives you another entire turn to set up an overwatch to deal with the threat. It is also a small but worthwhile note that if the final enemy of the mission has void touched and would become an Umbra after dying, you do not have to deal with the Umbra spawn. The mission complete dialogue pops between the void touched enemy dying and the spawning pool being created. It may only help once or twice in an entire campaign, but that could be the difference between finishing a mission and going home, or taking damage on another Pandoran turn because you were afraid to kill that enemy and risk spawning an Umbra. Myrmidons. Not to be confused with the Myrmidon variant of the Arthron. These are a species entirely of their own that was introduced with the Festering Skies DLC. Small, flying units with a nasty stinger that can inflict poison or acid on later variants. Myrmidons have a unique giveaway when they're taking their turn that you may notice. It hitches for a second before they act, as they're more stressful for the AI to use, most likely thanks to their flight ability. If you aren't seeing an enemy move in the fog of war, but it feels like the enemy turn timer is constantly chugging, bear in mind that moving forwards, you've likely got a bunch of these hanging around on rooftops or in sneaky nooks. They can be dealt with entirely by simply disabling their torso, which does get progressively tankier throughout the variants. Failing to do this, you could severely cripple their movement to deal with them later on by breaking one of their wings. This removes their flight and even slows their ground speed. You should exercise caution with melee weapons or close quarters approaches to the poison and acid varieties, as these erupt on death. One final farewell before they depart. This can be advantageous, however, as the explosion is rather large at a 4-tile radius, giving you an easy opportunity in some cases to turn these buggers into friendly fire disasters for the Pandorans. They're also very useful to use as suicide bombers if you can manage to mind control them. You should consider that while these enemies were always pushed as something to be combated using Overwatch tactics, your soldiers will have a nasty habit of acquiring the target as it starts its movement, aiming and firing after the Myrmidon has already vanished behind cover, causing your shot to be dumped into a low wall or bench. Overwatch has its place in the game. It only really works when you can catch one of these mid-flight and get an uninterrupted sightline to blast it out of the sky. Be careful of expecting the AI targeting to account for obstructions. It won't. Sirens. Sirens are the first real hurdle you'll hit. If you've got a phobia of anything creepy, crawly, or stabby, you won't like them. Ever. They're covered in sturdy chitin, mentally fortified and enhanced, fast, absolutely lethal in melee. Sirens are a terrifying foe, even more so when there's more than one on the field at a time. You'll be torn between wanting to shoot them in the face to remove their insanely dangerous psychic abilities, shooting them in the tail to stop their advance, or just dumping everything you've got into them to make sure that they're dead, hoping that the other enemies won't do too much damage after being ignored for a turn. There is, unfortunately, no definitive answer for any of this. All of these are valid options, and the situations you'll be facing are going to be varied. Unlike other enemies, I can say for certain there is one bit of kit that is designed perfectly for the Siren, and you sure do have to get in close to use it. It's the stun baton. It sounds insane, but the shock value of 600 on the stun lance is always going to work against a Siren. It will stop it using its psychic abilities, break any existing abilities in use, and leave it without the AP to even swing its arm blades. Very few enemies in the game come across like they're designed within the range of being vulnerable to an exact piece of equipment consistently, and whilst the stun baton is effective against Tritons and Arthrons too, it shines when you use it to brain a Siren. Outside of that, your other options typically include shredding it down as it advances, then unloading as much damage as possible to the weakest body part left, which I usually find to be the tail. Everything about this enemy screams to stay away from it, but snipers do relatively little due to the high HP of the body parts. You'll want to be in its face with shotguns, heavy cannons, melee weapons, even PDWs. Turrets are also a fantastic option against a Siren, being able to ignore its psychic abilities and potentially distract it from using its high bleed damage melee attack on your squishy soldiers. The turret can happily soak it. It ain't got time to bleed. Chirons. The Pandorans have an interesting take on artillery. If you suffer from trypophobia, they're likely the worst thing that this game can present to you, a living bombardment tool. While early Chirons strictly launch 3 flavours of the worms, giving you time to react and deal with the threat, the later variants aren't very patient. They hurl blobs of goo that will immobilise your soldiers and deny travel over some terrain without the research to safely negate the effect. Or even worse, they drop cluster bombs of explosive or acid directly on your soldiers' positions. It devastates cover, rendering armour useless and punishing you for keeping squad members within reach of each other. Phoenix Point offers you a few options of dealing with these long-ranged arseholes reliably. Chirons always fall on the side of mentally fragile, with their heads never developing armour and only being 100 HP. It's quite easy to disable their head and cause them to panic with just a little virus, or by removing other enemies on the field. Chirons also require a lot of spare AP to fire their salvo, so Daze, Paralyze and Sonic are all solid options to make them miss a turn. Mutoids also have a huge target to aim for on the Chiron when using Paralyzed Limb, the firing abdomen. While usually heavily armoured and housing the majority of the HP pool, a single hit from Paralyzed Limb is enough to stop it in its tracks. This can even cause the Chiron to flee in some cases, as they consider themselves to have no offensive potential remaining. The final option is Terror from the Void specific. Poison. The Trembling debuff will cause havoc with the Chiron's aiming. That 50% aim reduction over the range that they fire leads to some dramatic misses that can still pose a risk to targets that may have been entirely unintended. This is far more beneficial for you if you find your team hugging the side of the map, as there's a huge probability of the shots simply disappearing outside of the allowed area. It's worth noting that while the Chiron is capable of developing a few different leg mutations, they'll rarely come into play. I don't think I've ever seen a Chiron take a swing with its melee damage legs. The stomp legs can be avoided by staying out of its limited movement range, and its stability legs will cause it to fire more accurately with a greater projectile count, but leave it highly vulnerable to the previously mentioned disabling mechanics that you can throw at it. Worth noting that if you lower its accuracy with poison while the Chiron is stable, it doesn't return to its normal accuracy. It appears to lower its buffed accuracy by 50%, so it still brings it below its standard value. Scyllas. These are big, scary monstrosities. You'll have seen them on the loading screens, the screenshots, the store page image. Scyllas are highly varied in what they come equipped with. None of them should be taken lightly, especially on Terror from the Void, as it significantly buffed the enemy. Terror version Scyllas have acid resistance by default, 200 willpower. They're more aggressive with faster ability usage as well as improved AI that sees them prioritise your soldiers and be less distracted than their vanilla counterparts. If you know about the standard Shred, Virus, Warcry, sorry Warcry, you don't exist in Terror from the Void, Kite, Rinse, Repeat tactic for a Scylla, it isn't that simple in Terror from the Void. They're a fight that you have to take head on. They require planning, squad spacing, attack and ability order, and potentially bringing additional equipment just in case one is present in a Haven defense mission. Scylla get 5 parts that are interchanged across their variants: the head, weapon, carapace, abdomen and legs, as well as the potential to come in with a heavily armoured shroud that makes it harder to hit their abdomen from certain angles, with the heaviest versions of the Scylla also boasting a further 50% resistance to virus damage. They average around 4,000 HP total, with the most fragile body part rocking 30 armour. They are by all means terrifying. The first Scylla you encounter will be a Xenagos. This uses the Frenzy Head, Mist Carapace, Spawner Abdomen, Smasher Arms and Agile Legs. This setup gives it a buff to nearby Pandorans, increasing their speed and making them immune to panic, a Mist Spawn retaliation that happens once per turn. Without care, this will end up engulfing the entire battlefield in a thick, sightline disrupting mist, and they have the ability to spawn Mindfraggers, usually in said mist, making them harder to hit with direct shots from a long range. And most importantly, they have a devastating melee attack, and the ability to close into melee range if their pathing is blocked by jumping directly next to your soldiers before crushing them under those mammoth pincers. This is a 100 damage melee attack with 30 shred, and burst 2, 1 for each arm. Any soldier expected to survive an encounter with a Scylla has to have 200 HP minimum, with few able to take sustained hits due to the loss of max HP every time this monster breaks a limb. The other variants can see it spitting a line of poisonous goo, screaming a blast wave that disables any soldier caught in its path due to how high the sonic damage is. It can also use an absolutely biblical ranged attack with its cannon arms, hitting for 80 damage, 30 shred, on a burst of 20 in a cone across the front of it. It also has the ability to launch mist rather than release it defensively in some cases, as well as exploding in a shower of Mindfraggers upon death rather than spawning them throughout combat. There isn't a single version of this enemy that doesn't have at least one horrifying risk. So what can you do against such reckless hate? What you need is a force that works in unison if you want to bring a Scylla down. Snipers can mark it for death, heavies can shred a specific body part, assaults can dump all of their damage into the exposed body part, berserkers can be ready with adrenaline rush, holding the line for your team, priests can keep allies immune to the panic with their psychic ward, supporting others with a frenzy buff. They can also assist you with mind sense to check the mist for hidden risks, and clear the mist using mind crush. Your technician can provide huge, cheap heals, restoring limbs if they're broken after a Scylla hits, as well as providing a lot of support fire thanks to their turrets, which may also soak a melee hit for the team if needed. The Infiltrator can overwhelm the Scylla early on with spider drones, weakening multiple limbs due to the large blast radius if it can get right underneath its body, greatly helping you dealing direct damage or putting on dot applications. The Infiltrator also provides you with the skill Decoy, which can be an absolute lifesaver if deployed correctly, baiting the Scylla to attack the vulnerable hologram stood in harm's way and ignoring your very real at-risk berserker who needs a turn to catch their breath. Whichever way you go, the Scylla is going to take a lot of rounds to kill and is unlikely to go down without a fight. If encountered in a Haven defense, a Scylla will try and flee if they drop below a certain HP threshold. It appears between 50 to 60%. If you can kill a Scylla before they leave, you save yourself a lot of trouble. Otherwise, you need to face them at their citadel, their home turf, which will see Pandoran reinforcements constantly spawning and the terrain typically play into their advantage. For most players, Scyllas are the enemies. They're the ones that you want to try your team composition on. They're what you look forward to fighting, as it's going to be tooth and nail, leaving a mess of a battlefield and a scar or two to take home with you. They are the best targets to really see what your gear can do. That big acid cannon, that sleek shredding shotgun, the poison crossbow. However you choose to do the damage and bring them down, know that it's unlikely to be clean, even more so with Terror from the Void. If you prepare your team for the worst, you'll get to travel home and celebrate that the worst didn't happen. If you turn up overconfident, cocky, trying to show off, the game uses its magic sixth sense to throw this RNG at you, full force. Those misses that are only a single pixel, that mind control that hits exactly the wrong person on the wrong turn, that single extra point of movement which you don't have, meaning someone's going to bleed to death right before your eyes. You can't sleep on a Scylla, no matter how experienced you are, but you can enjoy the brawl once you've gotten a few of their heads mounted on the wall of the Phoenix bases. Acherons. If you hated the game when it first released, you'll be glad to hear they've added an enemy that'll make you curse and hate it even more. Don't worry, Terror from the Void rebalanced these guys dramatically, so the early variants are nowhere near as ridiculous. They're still annoying walking ball bags that have the amazing tendency to wreck your plans constantly. Acherons are a true support unit. They buff, heal, call in reinforcements, resurrect corpses. They're a massive threat on the field that does next to no actual damage to your units. While they are able to disable your soldiers' limbs for a turn, reduce their movement, or lower their accuracy, by themselves an Acheron will never really hurt your team. They just hinder it constantly. The problem is, if you leave them, they make every single one of your turns harder, compounding in this effect every time. What used to be a single line of mist and a lone enemy is now 2 massive lines of mist halfway across the map, and oh great, 3 new enemies have appeared through this. Remember how you poisoned a Chiron so it'd keep missing? Well, the Acheron took it upon itself to heal that, so now the worms are landing right on top of your squad. It's annoyances like this every turn. They aren't necessarily hard to kill either. Their limbs are fragile, so landing an incendiary near them typically sees them walk or jump through the fire, break their own head, arms and legs, and now they're dealt with. So, with all of these breaks, how the hell do they still have that much HP left? Now they're wandering around dropping gas clouds instead on top of your soldiers and just getting in the way. They attract all this fire from AI soldiers who are inevitably missing because they're aiming for its head and the positioning makes auto fire miss every shot. I can't put into words how simultaneously easy these enemies are to actually deal with and how much you'll hate them because they're just sponges. Annoying, disruptive sponges. If you want to kill them really fast, get them to jump up on a roof and then blow the floor out from underneath them. They die instantly from any fall damage, regardless of how short the fall was. Anything with more than a 1 tile footprint, this works on. Fraggers, worms, eggs. The small Pandorans are all relatively easy to deal with and very much one and done in what they do. The Mindfragger is a skittering, suicidal mind control device. It detaches its own head and glomps onto a soldier, inflicting mind control until the fragger itself is removed. You can bash a fragger off with your soldiers in melee, or, if you're feeling risky, shoot it, preferably with a single shot weapon that doesn't do too much overkill damage. Just be aware that shooting a mind-controlled soldier that has, say, return fire, runs the risk of being on the receiving end of said return fire if you don't actually kill the fragger. Terror from the Void also adds a bit of spice. It gives Mindfraggers acidic blood. Now, if you let them attach to a soldier before dealing with them, the soldier is also going to take a chunk of damage off of their armour from the acid burn. This applies to engaging a Mindfragger in melee too. If you want to safely dispose of a fragger, you can simply disable the head without dealing so much damage that they die. They'll wander off, eventually bleed to death somewhere that is of no consequence to you, and leave a cloud of acid there. Poison, fire, and acid worms all work the same. They wriggle as close to you as possible, and explode if you're within 3 tiles. It's worth remembering that worms are immune to the damage they inflict, so mind controlling a poison worm won't be able to detonate it near its friends and kill them with the poison. The blast damage will hit, but it won't be enough. Worms are easily dispatched, and even easier to outpace, including their improved movement range in Terror from the Void. If you're trying to exit the map, don't get slowed down trying to kill every worm on the way out. You'll be safe simply avoiding them in most situations. This means you're on the map for less turns, so you're at less risk of higher danger reinforcements arriving while you were busy crushing bugs. Eggs are also self-explanatory. They contain the creature that is listed and hatch into a battle-ready version if your soldiers move too close, or if they hit it with a stray bullet. The main risk of eggs typically comes from another enemy, the hatching Sentinel, so we'll explain that next. Sentinels. Sentinels are immobile Pandoran structures that provide area denial in a variety of ways. The Mist Sentinel spawns a cloud of Pandoran mist beneath itself every turn it's left active. While this cloud starts small, it expands a tile out for each following spawn, so that tiny 3x3 area soon becomes a quarter of the map. It ruins sightlines and allows Pandorans to sneak up on your soldiers, especially dangerous with fast moving enemies like Mindfraggers that can catch you unaware by jumping out the edge of the mist, having previously been silent and undetected. The Hatching Sentinel is exclusive to Pandoran nest missions. They're the objective, and you'll need to destroy 2 of them to win. They have a large observation area around them, which is triggered when a soldier moves into it, regardless of wall cover or visibility, causing them to prepare a surge that will hatch all nearby eggs in the nest. Whilst dealing with a few worms or Mindfraggers isn't hard, if you move too far on your last soldier and make this happen, you'll be out of luck for setting up overwatches or getting better positions to avoid the swarm. You need to try and deal with a Hatching Sentinel on the turn you awaken it. Both of these variants are dealt with in the same way. Shred one part, dump a couple of bursts into it. I find that the head is generally more reliable for most angles, as with scouting for stealth Tritons, you can look deeper into the map of a nest and locate Hatching Sentinels before physically scouting it. You're likely to find dim blue lights around the site of a Sentinel, and there'll be a centre tile that you are not allowed to move to. Hatching Sentinels will also always spawn in the same chunk of the map and cannot appear in corridor pieces. Mist Sentinels are less rigid in their locations, but they're likely to be spawned at the centre of the map to give the greatest coverage. They also seem to favour hugging the edges of buildings where possible, allowing them to make the lower floors highly dangerous to travel through if they even get a couple of mist spawns off. The Terror Sentinel is the larger, more punishing Sentinel of this group, and you'll only likely see them in lairs or citadel assaults. They're a tanky spire of 3 torsos and heads that channel a high range psychic scream if you enter their engagement zone, which is in itself quite large. They're designed to slow your progress through locations, giving the Pandorans time to summon more reinforcements or get a flank on you. While bonuses like Frenzy or Psychic Ward can negate the potential panic these Sentinels inflict, the loss of will points can significantly reduce your tactical flexibility throughout deployment. So, consider dealing with these in a single turn to minimise the amount of screams they're allowed to get off in an engagement. Spawneries. This enemy looks disgusting. A writhing mass of egg sacs with a large gaping maw. In reality, these things do nothing but bleed. The Spawnery is the objective in the Lair type mission, a tier 2 Pandoran base. Much like scouting an invisible enemy or a sentinel, you can mouse around the fog of war at the start of the mission and locate a tile the Spawnery will be located on. It is always surrounded by a horseshoe of high stone pillars to block most long range attacks, encouraging you to get in close and destroy the egg pods and make it bleed to death quickly. At 3600 HP, the Spawnery looks almost as tanky as a Scylla, albeit far less dangerous. There are 3 egg pods on either side of the structure, which cause a bleed of 80 when destroyed and lower the max HP of the Spawnery by 500, so in actuality, it dies very quickly once you burst these eggs. This is where a little bit of bombardment can really save you time. Immolating the area will burn and eventually destroy all of the egg pods in one big burst, meaning you don't need to get close to kill it. Alternatively, you can use a standard grenade launcher and land a few shots on either side to simply destroy the pods with blast damage. Dealing with the Spawnery in this way saves you spending AP on movement and allows your team to better cover each other from reinforcements on the map. It also assists with grabbing the resource crates that can spawn in a lair mission that usually contain a large amount of mutagens and occasionally weaponry. Remember, they aren't dangerous. Take your time, plan your turns, and make sure everyone gets back from these missions safely. I consider lair maps easier than nests. They have more open space, better positions to post up, and play far more to players' strengths than Pandorans. Corruption nodes. This enemy is a rare and horrifying encounter. If a haven is corrupted, you can fight to free it and save some of the population. The corruption node is what needs to be dealt with for this to happen. It is a solid chunk of HP, only one limb to shoot, the body, which comes quite heavily armoured. The corruption node will spawn inside a building and it's built entirely around trying to force you into close quarters combat, which takes advantage of its AoE attack, dealing 95 damage over a 9 tile radius, ignoring 60 armour and applying virus. This attack can hit through walls and floors, but also occasionally appears to be blocked by terrain or shields. It's a little inconsistent, and you shouldn't rely on blocking it. Your best option to deal with this node is to burn the house down. Make sure when you deploy on this mission you bring additional sniper ammo, heavy cannon ammo, rockets, extra grenades. You want to be able to destroy walls, ceilings and barricades easily. Once you've secured the map and only need to worry about the occasional reinforcement, take your time clearing an open line for your team that looks directly at the corruption node without needing to play into its range. Then shoot it as many times as it takes to win the mission. I've definitely lost a squad or two getting overconfident and trying to deal all of the damage required to kill it inside the building, only to end up a little short and have nearly the entire squad panic from a single of the node's attacks, which leads to them standing around in the building for a second or even third strike. It's not worth the risk. Level the map, thank me later. The Pure. Mechanical soldiers, absolutely devastating for a new player, and usually introduced in the campaign so early that you'll expect them to be a fair challenge. You can thank the Blood and Titanium DLC for these guys. The issue, if you'd like to call it something as simple as that, with the Pure is that the first stage of the Bionic enhancement is all of the tankiest modules. The Clarity Head, Armadillo Legs and Juggernaut Torso. The lowest armour value is 30 on the head, and you'll do much better breaking their arms to stop the cybernetic powerhouses in the field, which means bypassing the even higher armour on their arms. The Pure will be a new player's introduction to the hit and run tactics. They roll in highly durable but relatively immobile, with low movement values and weapons that cost a significant amount of AP to fire. They often are encountered on scavenge missions, or worse, ambushes. You'll want your assaults grabbing crates while your sniper and heavy try to pick off limbs when it's safe to do so. Getting dragged into a firefight with the Pure, especially early on, will end extremely poorly for your soldiers if they lack the shred, health and utility to lock them down, while the Pure have the raw stats to push through your front line and unload entire magazines without fear of taking more than a glancing blow from most of your small arms fire. Get used to hugging the edges of the map against this enemy, as the last place you want to be is surrounded on all sides by the Pure. Breaking a hole in their line is hard. Finding the time to push through that hole in their wall is even harder. Make sure you don't need to whenever possible. The Forsaken. When mutation is taken too far, soldiers become Forsaken. This faction is similar to the Pure, turning up on ambushes and scavenge missions to fight you. Much like the Pure, their strongest mutations arguably come from the first stage, so they're more dangerous to fight early on and get progressively squishier, meaning in this case, weaker. The regeneration torso is especially frustrating to deal with, as now breaking an arm is meaningless as it's repaired on the enemy's turn. Whilst more mobile than the Pure, the Forsaken aren't exactly sprinters either. They do carry Arnu weapons rather than the new Jericho firearms that the Pure use, so they're cheaper to fire, allowing for greater flexibility. The Forsaken are also far more focused on close ranged combat. They use virus rifles, shotguns, melee weapons and pistols. Whereas you fight to disable the Pure to remove them from the field in the early game, you need to focus fire the Forsaken and bring them down instead, opening a weakness on them one at a time via Shred with your Heavy or Berserker and exploiting the weakness with your Assault. Trying to single out the Forsaken is the hard part. Fortunately, as they're biological, not bionic, they're more likely to spend a turn healing, so timing a grenade well to almost inflict what I consider distraction damage will tie them up as you deal with their squad mates. Even if they don't take the bait, you've likely shredded them in preparation for your next turn, making it easier to down them quickly and move on. Do your best not to get overconfident in melee with the Forsaken. They run berserkers of their own who ignore broken limbs, gain bonus damage from being hurt, lower damage received within 10 tiles. It's rough. They're also one of the factions that do make use of priests, so expect mind control, panic, virus, frenzy. The Forsaken have simply a massive array of possible skills. It's why you want them down and done rather than running around wounded, vengeful and bloodthirsty. Human enemies. You'll encounter bandits, Arnu, New Jericho and Synedrian forces across your campaign. Almost all human enemies follow the same logic. Do they have a two-handed weapon? Yes, break their arm. Do they have a one-handed weapon? Yes, finish them. Do they have a mounted weapon like a rocket launcher? Yes, and kill them immediately. The main takeaway from fighting the different factions is their combat style. Bandits have the same classes as Phoenix, but far worse gear. They're mostly fodder. Arnu fight close and dirty with virus, bleed and acid. New Jericho fight mid to long and favour explosives, fire, shred damage. Synedrian fight unseen and at the longest distance using poison or paralysis wherever possible, preferring to ensure that they land their low damage shot with highly accurate weapons. They don't fit neatly into a rock paper scissors system either, despite how it may look at a glance. One isn't necessarily a hard counter to the other. Usually it's a mix of both that works best, or even a combination of all three if possible. I personally prefer the high accuracy of Synedrian firearms and the accuracy bonus of their armour range, the explosive options that New Jericho offers, and the raw damage that Arnu gear can bring to a fight, such as the cataclysmically damaging shotguns, the Harrower and Iconoclast. Finding the style that you enjoy playing and matching the gear to best accentuate that playstyle will be what helps you with human encounters. If you want to get in close, tanked up in New Jericho gear and tear the place down with cannons, melee weapons and explosives, go for it. Just make sure you've got something to cover the long range risks so that, say, any pesky Synedrian snipers are punished for camping on a rooftop, blown limb from limb when a Ragnarok missile lands at their feet. There is one more large, plot critical enemy in the game, but it's something you got to see for yourself. Whilst the encounter itself isn't groundbreaking, it's certainly an experience the first time you attempt it. I'll simply say, bring everything you've got. Your full A-team, no inventory slot left unfilled, no squad space left open. Part C. The Geoscape and missions. Why use many missions when few types do trick? The Geoscape Exploration and Resources. Welcome to the Geoscape, your overview of the state of the world. When the game starts, you're randomly assigned one of the 18 Phoenix bases located on the map. Pray that it isn't in South or Central America. It's one of the worst starting locations for traversal. Whilst the Phoenix bases are static in their location, exploration points and the events that they contain are entirely randomised. When you initially start the game, the AI pitches the three factions in a small-scale war simulation, off-screen. This determines how their havens are dispersed. You'll likely find them in small clusters with the odd outlier here or there, with Arnu always having the highest number of havens and Synedrion the lowest. The remaining points of the map are randomly assigned to exploration events, missions, or ambushes, with a rare chance to become an independent haven instead. Terror from the Void changes the percentage of some of these events, making ambushes more likely but offering better rewards for surviving them, while making the highly beneficial missions like vehicle recovery or soldier rescue less likely due to how powerful they can be. Once a haven has been discovered, you'll be alerted to any Pandoran attacks that it's subjected to. You'll also be expected to help them where possible. The longer you leave a haven defense, the more the balance tips in the stronger side's favour. So, if the defending strength is 16 and the attacking strength is 11, you could safely ignore this mission. You won't gain any reward, but the haven will be able to handle the threat by themselves. If the attacking strength is greater, that haven will either suffer catastrophic damage or fall without your aid. If you do help a haven, you're given tech, materials, and food as standard, with a bonus to the haven's attitude and the overall faction's favour of who you defended. Later in the game, defending a haven may also hurt your reputation with the other two factions, as their personal politics sour on one another, and they would sooner see others fall alone rather than survive together. This plays into the very simple diplomacy mechanic that Phoenix Point employs. Do something for a faction, gain their support. Anger a faction, lose their support. If you gain enough support from a faction, they will share the location of their havens with you, saving you a good chunk of exploration time on the Geoscape. They will also share some of their research, eventually allowing you to assist them with their studies at the highest level. If, however, you repeatedly upset a faction, they will stop trading with you. They'll block you from recruiting their soldiers, and make it harder for you to learn the technology that they have access to. If you're happy to continue antagonising a faction, you could raid their bases for resources, steal their aircraft or technology. This allows you to access more resources and research that they are trying to keep away from you. Aircraft theft can be incredibly lucrative, as it saves you a huge chunk of production time and resources, allowing you to field another squad, which may give you the opportunity to earn reputation back that you lost from stealing the ship in the first place. Just be aware that when certain thresholds of aggression with another faction are reached, you can't repair the bridges, they're burned for good. So, consider your timing of these acquisitions very carefully. Phoenix bases can also be attacked like havens. You're given a significant warning if it's going to happen within 24 hours with an exact attack location. Base defences aren't particularly difficult. There's a natural choke point built into the base design, and the Pandorans all spawn in the aircraft hangar. If you don't build an access lift, we'll talk about base building later, in your bases, your soldiers will all spawn in the central room, grouping them together. This allows for a very simple defense, as the Pandorans are forced to walk into your grinder of overwatches, fire, and very little cover. If you do make an access lift, your squad will start scattered. You'll likely have to hunt down the Pandorans across your base, which allows them to beat on your facilities and cause far more damage. So it's an easy choice to make. After completing a haven or base defense, you also have a chance to discover a Pandoran structure to retaliate. If you have the satellite coverage over the Pandoran's base, it's revealed and the point of origin is known on the Geoscape. This time, you can take the fight back to them. There are 3 tiers of Pandoran bases to assault: a nest, the lair, and a citadel. The nest mission consists of fighting through tight corridors against low-ranking Pandorans, your Arthrons, Tritons, worms, Mindfraggers, whilst avoiding waking too many eggs by triggering the hatching sentinel. Some spawns on these maps can be incredibly generous, and allow you to complete the mission in a single turn, as both hatching sentinels will be immediately visible. Remaining enemies on the map don't matter. Once the sentinels are down, you immediately evacuate and win, which means you should also ensure that no soldiers are mind controlled when you land the final blow. Sometimes they're counted as lost. The lair is a more open area, with larger threats to accompany it. The only Pandoran that can't spawn in this area is the Scylla, with reinforcement points scattered around the map that will continue to send smaller threats as the mission progresses. They may be small in terms of body size, but a Siren is still a pretty big threat. The goal of the lair is to destroy the Spawnery, a huge, immobile structure that lacks any offensive capability. This can be done in a few ways, allowing you to pick the tactic best suited to your team. These maps are also likely to have small Pandoran buildings present. They look like the top 2/3 of an egg, and they contain a chest in the centre. These chests are a fantastic source of mutagens and kit if you can grab them. It's well worth a small detour to do so. The final tier of these buildings is the Citadel. These only appear if a Scylla is present. If you fight a Haven defense and the Scylla escapes after it took too much damage, it will be wounded. You can chase it back to the Citadel if you're quick enough. If you kill a Scylla in a Haven defense mission, it causes the Citadel to downgrade to a lair on the Geoscape. So, Citadel encounters are generally quite rare to come across. It takes a long time for a Pandoran base to level up to max, and you can directly impact if you have to deal with the Scylla in a Haven or on its own turf. Citadels are full of huge walls designed to block sight and even high arc explosives. It comes with numerous reinforcement points, potential Sentinel spawn points, and usually has a minimum of 3 loot boxes. Fighting a Scylla in this location definitely plays into its advantage, so turn up to a Citadel with more ammo and equipment than you would usually land with. You need to secure your flank for a solid couple of turns to be able to deal with the Scylla cleanly, and panic is a real possibility. Many enemies spawn mist, scream, or apply virus. The upside of destroying a Citadel is that the reputation gain for dealing with this structure is huge. The bonus is average for a lair and practically trivial for a nest, so there is a merit to waiting for these Pandoran structures to level up to the next tier before you deal with them. Just don't leave it for too long. Nearby havens are upset by your lack of action and will actually cause a reputation penalty if too much time passes. In terms of exact exploration types, you have your standard text events which will offer you a choice of 2 to 4 options. Your selection will provide anything from a reputation bonus or penalty to free resources, research points, or even the occasional free soldier. It is worth having a quick read over some of these events before blindly picking an option. Some of the reputation hits will be significant and can make it hard to earn a faction's technology if you are constantly annoying them. These text events can happen in both havens and wilderness locations, with the haven event typically having a higher impact reputation choice and the wilderness providing a greater resource gain opportunity. There are scavenge missions, which require you to drop a squad into an AO, grab resources from scattered crates and evac while facing an already present enemy force and reinforcements that progressively get more dangerous. I typically enter a scavenge mission with the bare minimum equipment required to function. The sooner you are in and out, the better. Greed is your downfall on a scavenge mission if you aren't careful. If you land relatively close to a lot of boxes, weigh up your options before you cross the entire map to grab the remaining one. Smart use of your assaults or a vehicle on these missions is typically highly beneficial. You can use fast classes with free inventory management to loot crates and redistribute the items out to the other, slower classes that are providing you the cover. It also tests your priority management and sightlines. It is very possible to split the team in these missions and fall back to different extraction points, but you need to make sure that you're never leaving a member without any form of support, as that'll keep the whole team behind trying to save them and run the risk of you being overwhelmed by the enemy reinforcements. Greed is good, risk management is better. Get in, get out. You may be lucky enough to discover a rescue or recovery mission. These can potentially net you some new soldiers or even a vehicle. You can gain anywhere from 2 to 4 soldiers that fall into the heavy, sniper or assault class and be anywhere from level 1 to 4. I've personally never seen higher. The stats go alongside the level of the soldiers and can be very powerful on a higher difficulty run, as the points that they gain to strength, willpower and speed are extremely expensive to gain through standard missions, so you want to prioritise saving the highest levels on the map, sometimes at the expense of another potential soldier. After all, a level 1 fodder is just fodder. Vehicles are a fantastic game, and whilst they take more space in an aircraft and typically need a team that is more tailored around utilising them, they make for a substantial power gain in the early or mid game, enough to carry an inexperienced team to victory numerous times in most cases. A vehicle is unlikely to bring as much flexibility to a mission as a full squad of soldiers. It generally ends up railroading the supporting soldiers into leaning towards what it does best. Explosive for the Phoenix Scarab, tanky APC nonsense with an Armadillo, paralysis abuse from the Aspida, or general shenanigans with the grossly overpowered and aptly named Chaos Buggy, which was beyond broken on release and is still very much head and shoulders above the competition. This may be a good chance to transition into talking about vehicles, and also mention another mutagen based option that you can field, Mutogs. If Mutoids are mutated humanoids, Mutogs are mutated doggos. The Mutogs are quick to mention, and something that I personally rarely use, as I find them to be absolutely enormous targets, typically requiring a lot of R&R to fix after an intense mission. They come with one of two types of head, tail, and legs, with all variations available as soon as you complete the research, so you can always get your desired combo. There is a venomous head, which applies poison at a short range, and a ramming head, which does reasonable melee damage and shred with a large shock value. You can pick between the slasher or basher tail, with a slasher inflicting bleed and a basher doing a huge amount of shred. The leg choices are agile or regeneration, with agile offering better move speed and a leap, but regeneration keeping the Mutog healed throughout the mission. The regeneration legs can also assist in the following mission by allowing a turn or two of regeneration to occur before the Mutog engages in combat, reducing some of the time needed to heal it back at base. These beasts are chunky, with relatively average armour, somewhere around what a standard assault would wear, but ranging from 1.5 to 1.7 thousand HP. And they need it. Mutogs have very little in the way of ranged offense and take multiple tiles of space. They also have a huge profile and a relatively low limb strength despite their massive HP pool. They don't level up or gain additional abilities. Mutogs just are. The best way of looking at them is that they are a quick, inexpensive way of getting out a large, somewhat dangerous threat to support a squad that maybe has the space for them. While I wouldn't see myself ever building a squad around a Mutog, if I had the option to get one ready in time for a base defense, I probably wouldn't pass it up. Maybe that's their niche, a cheap, fast base defense unit that just sits around and waits for the Pandorans to arrive so it can block the entrance to the base and soak all the damage for your soldiers. The vehicles that you have access to are all tied to a specific faction. Arnu make Mutogs, New Jericho makes the heavily armoured APC, Synedrian makes the healing and paralysing support hovercraft, and Phoenix Point makes the bunker-busting long-range missile artillery. And you have the Chaos Syndicate, giving you access to a pile of junk that somehow has better armour than the APC, better damage potential than your artillery, and more staying power than support craft. Yes, the Chaos Buggy is busted. Vehicles are strange in their interactions at times and can open up some extremely cheesy strategies, including Whack-A-Mole, which involves having a Berserker in a vehicle that simply pops out of the back or front, hits an enemy in melee, and re-enters, all in one turn, never exposing themselves to danger. The Chaos Engine DLC also saw a lot of equipment added for all of the vehicle types, some of which is just strictly better, with zero downsides, others of which actively hinder your ability to use the vehicle effectively. There is a reason that I said the Chaos Buggy lived up to his name, so let's talk about what you've got to work with real quick. Starting with the Phoenix Scarab, this typically uses a long-range missile launcher that fires twin rockets 4 times a mission. It's a high damage approach that relies on getting in and out of a mission with great speed, due to how fast it's able to expend all of its ammunition, turning it into a very large target that can only then block shots or ferry units around the map. The modules for all vehicles feature weapon, hull and engine upgrades. The Scarab gains access to a heavy cannon and a vastly improved missile turret. The cannon is a larger version of the Hell Cannon that the heavies use, a single shot, high shock turret. Whilst it can hit for a huge amount of damage, it still only has 4 shots, and it'll quickly see the Scarab rendered nearly useless. The second missile turret that it can unlock, however, is simply insane. The base turret hits for 80 blast over a 3.5 radius. The improved turret hits for 120 blast over 5.5, has a higher range with 0 downside. 0. The same amount of shots, the same accuracy, simply broken. Throw it on and see for yourself. It's like bringing 4 mini nukes on every mission. Absolutely no Pandoran has limbs left after this thing fires a salvo, and it turns any human enemy into a blood pinata. The Scarab has a couple of hull options, some cargo racks and the carbon fibre plating. To be blunt, the inventory upgrade makes absolutely no sense to me. I think it's intended to help your soldiers access the vehicle storage from outside of the unit. However, the interior storage is practically unlimited, so for the majority of missions you'll be using your vehicle to carry cargo. It's far easier just to enter, drop everything inside and then exit again. I'm sure that it does have its uses, but I have never found one for it. The carbon fibre adds some additional armour to tank, and it reduces the effect of the acid by half. It's a straight upgrade, far better. The engine options are interesting, as one is very much not an engine. You have access to an advanced mapping module which increases the speed, or you can equip reinforced caterpillar tracks, which actually lowers speed, but it allows the Scarab to drive directly over worms, Mindfraggers and even Myrmidons, something that vehicles, despite their size, can't normally do. This obviously pairs well with the carbon plating, as acid Myrmidons and Mindfraggers, if you're counting Terror from the Void, explode when killed and bathe the tank in acid consistently. Whilst the instant kill nature of the tracks are very appealing, the speed reduction on a tank that already requires 3 AP to fire its weapon is a heavy consideration. Although, it might be worth considering that this allows the Scarab to remain dangerous even when it's out of ammo, clearing the map like an angry Roomba. The new Jericho Armadillo is more tanky than the Scarab, but it lacks any long-range punch. This isn't saying that it's a slouch in the damage department though. With its higher armour and reinforced front panelling, the Armadillo can draw fire for multiple turns and carry on fighting without fear. It's deployed as standard with a Hailstorm Gauss turret, a mounted version of the new Jericho heavy machine gun. It deals high damage at very close range and rips armoured targets to shreds quickly, boasting a high ammo capacity that keeps it viable in extended firefights, and especially effective against large targets like a Scylla or a Chiron. The Armadillo can also be equipped with 2 of the spicier weapon options, the Mephistopheles flamethrower, which will ruin your in-game audio by replacing the background noise with a constant crackling fire sound, so despite its amazing damage, range and area denial potential, you basically need to mute the game to use this and not go crazy.
I can imagine sneaking some engineers. Please do not touch defensive structure.
The other, less busted option is the Purgatory Grenade Launcher. Whilst it is less explosive than the Scarab's launcher options, it comes with the handy bonus of being able to launch an incendiary projectile, giving you access to 4 long-range, high-radius incendiary bombs that can easily control the flow of battle from the very beginning if you drop it directly on the enemy spawn location. Yes, a super cheap tactic, but it gets solid results. While the Gauss turret is the best suited weapon to the majority of situations, a shotgun or AoE based team can do incredibly well with a Purgatory equipped tank. Soften up a group with some explosives from a heavy so that they've got little to no armour left, and then finish them off with a large radius pool of fire. Just make sure to do it in that order. Otherwise, the explosive shockwave will extinguish the fire upon impact and let the enemies move freely. The Armadillo's hull options are a little underwhelming, with one being clearly superior. There's reinforced plating, which halves piercing damage, or lightweight alloy plating, which lowers the armour for a few extra inventory slots. I already explained how meaningless inventory space is on a vehicle, but the pierce damage protection is also rarely a factor. It'll do something, but it just isn't a huge upgrade. The majority of Pandoran pierce damage is tied to a status effect that would never affect a vehicle anyway. Poison, virus, paralysis. It might be a little overkill. The engine upgrade is where you'll really scratch your head. One is a supercharger, which gives +7 speed. The other is a bi-turbo engine, which gives +14 speed. So, 0 downside to taking the engine upgrade, which is clearly better than the other. The Chaos Engine's DLC was such a mess, man. I understand that having a straight upgrade is nice, but you have 2 straight upgrades. Neither of them have a downside, and one is twice the bonus of the other. It's so strange, like, they had the ideas planned out of what the other upgrade could be, and ran out of time, so they just threw on stats and called it done. The Synedrian Aspida is the most fragile of the vehicles, with the most niche role to fill in its default type. It has the least seating, no direct damage option, and it is a very delicate craft in a couple of key locations. It needs to be managed carefully in combat, or you'll be throwing them in the bin constantly. It comes as standard with tech arms, allowing it to do double strikes of paralysis, hitting for 40 total, which is more than enough to incapacitate all early game enemies, most mid game enemies, and severely hamper late game threats. The tech arm is also capable of fully restoring your own soldiers, healing limb damage and HP alike. This ability does also work on vehicles if you happen to end up in the extremely rare situation of having two on the field, so the value is insane. The Aspida does have two other weapon options, but I highly suggest tempering your expectations with them. Both are dual weapons, placed on an arm on either side of the Aspida's cabin, meaning that if you use a manually aimed shot, you will, almost always, miss with one of the two projectiles, wasting 50% of your potential ammo. The other option is letting the game auto-aim, leaving the AI to take the shot, which removes your option of disabling limbs and can still result in the shot colliding with geometry, or, more annoyingly, causing the AI to aim for the most armoured part of the target, netting 0 effect. Anyway, the options are the Apollo laser cannon, which is close to the Synedrian sniper rifle, just a bit more amped up. It has the best range of any weapon in the game, outside of some of the broken laser backpacks which you'll see later. But, as mentioned, it doesn't always hit. The other option is the Themis Neural Turret, a ranged paralysis option, applying the same amount as the tech arm, if the shots land, and offering you a safer distance to do so from. Honestly, stick with the tech arms. You get a 100% hit chance on the paralyze, and you get your heal ability. It's what the Aspida is designed to do. The Aspida can also be equipped with either an improved chassis or a psychic jammer. The chassis adds an additional seat, which doubles the capacity of this vehicle, but the psychic jammer is far more useful. It grants mind control immunity to nearby allies, similar to Psychic Ward. The biggest bonus of the jammer is that it can remove existing mind control, and the Aspida is a very quick vehicle. It gives you the option to move in, free your soldier, grab them in the driver's seat, and move to safety. Very effective indeed. It also has the option of two engine upgrades, a hybrid engine which gives the Aspida a dash, similar to the Assault class, usable twice a turn. Alternatively, you can take the experimental thrusters, which allow you to jump. While this does let you hop over threats or clear small gaps, be very careful about hopping the Aspida into any elevation that isn't completely solid. If the floor beneath it is broken, it's highly likely to come crashing down and immediately take fatal damage. The hybrid engine is a much safer bet. The Chaos Buggy is the last vehicle, and goddamn, this thing's overpowered. Even with some of the attempted balance, it just stands head and shoulders over the rest. Part of the reason that it's so much stronger is the nature of the Chaos Buggy weaponry. It's all combi turrets. The Vishnu is the default, so while all of the Chaos options come equipped with a minigun, they vary in their secondary fire. For reference, and these are vanilla values as Terra may have better balanced them since this script was written, the Armadillo MG does 40 damage, 5 shred, 8 burst. The Chaos minigun does 50 damage, 10 shred, 8 burst. That's twice the shred, with 10 more damage per shot. The Chaos minigun is capable of completely stripping the strongest Scylla armour in the game in a single burst. They're exactly the same range and ammo capacity before you think that that is the difference. It's bonkers. And that is one part of the Vishnu gun. The second part is a grenade launcher. 80 blast, 10 shred, single shot, 8 rounds. If that sounds familiar, it's because those are almost the stats of the Scarab's default rocket launcher. It does a little less shred and it fires in a single shot rather than 2 burst, meaning those 8 rounds can actually be spread over 8 shots, so you don't overkill targets, so it's not even a downside. Everything about this thing makes me scratch my head. Did a competition winner design these values? Are we getting power creep because it's the last DLC, so why bother making the vehicles do different things better, where you can just get this thing and do everything stupidly well? Anyway, It still has 2 more options. Again, both of these have the minigun as standard, same stats. The Screamer is a sonic turret, which hits for a sonic value of 20 and deals 80 blast. This absolutely destroys human opponents. Very few have a will value above 20, so you can stunlock a large enemy force and just clean them up in your own time. The full stop is the final option, a goo cannon. Whilst it deals no damage, it also has no limit to the amount of times it can be used. If an enemy doesn't have a ranged attack, it will never get to fight you because of this. Of course, the weapons aren't strong enough by themselves, so let's look at the hull upgrades. There's a revised armour plating, which offers blast resistance and adds an additional 30 armour to the Buggy. 30! Or you could use the spiked armour plating, which has the Thorns effect when struck in melee, dealing piercing damage and again, offering an additional 30 armour. This thing is busted. Wait, we've still got the engine to talk about. You can pick the experimental exhaust system, which gives plus 5 speed, or the jet boosters, which gives plus 11 speed. Does this sound familiar? You see, the jet boosters are listed as having an ammo capacity, so I firmly believe that they were only supposed to work for as many tiles as they had ammunition for, and then the bonus would be lost. Unless this has been patched in at some point, I've never seen this work as intended. And if I sound a little bitter about this, I kind of am. Part of the fun of Phoenix Point to me was that balance, that knife edge, that a certain damage value had to be tweaked perfectly. This thing just craps all over it. It's stronger, it's faster, it stays in combat for longer, it has more flexibility, it's just objectively better. There is no downside. It is the very definition of unbalanced power creep, easy mode, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, it's fun to use once or twice, but then it rapidly saps the fun out of any mission, because there is no challenge if you use this thing. You roll in, absolutely paste whatever the large target is on the map, and just leave with a shrug. You'll miss out on all of the epic close calls, the fights going tooth and nail, the moments where you let out a whispery, yes, because you needed that shot to hit, and it did. Give the Buggy a try, but don't let it rob you of what the game has to offer. All of the vehicles are supposed to be powerful because you give up 3 soldier slots to field one. This has the ammo capacity alone to win the damn fight by itself. It's a mess. Pulling us back towards the Geoscape, and sticking on the theme of vehicles, alongside ground vehicles you also have the opportunity to use a variety of aircraft and modules to support them. Terror from the Void makes one large change to aircraft with unit accommodation. By default, most ships now have significantly less seats, which requires you to install a FAR module, which returns the ship to its vanilla seating and allows soldiers to recover from fatigue slowly whilst on board. This is balanced out by splitting the cost of the manufacture between the ship and the module, so it's now cheaper to build an aircraft solely for air combat, as you can forego the FAR module and load up with weapons and defensive countermeasures. A small change, but a smart one. For the most part, the trade-off with aircraft is capacity versus speed, with some minor consideration of range and durability. The Synedrian Helios is the fastest option, but is incredibly fragile with the lowest maximum durability and the smallest capacity of just 5 soldiers, with vehicles taking 3 slots and Mutogs occupying 2. This means a Helios-based strike force needs to be precise in their win condition and adequately trained to achieve it. Losing a single soldier in combat dramatically lowers your chance of winning when you've only dropped in with 5. The Phoenix Manticore is a little slower than the Helios and has the worst fuel economy, giving it the lowest range in-game. It has average durability and what I would call a standard squad size of 6. It gives you enough flexibility to combine classes in a way that gives you a couple of solid approaches in how you're going to handle a mission, or allows you to take a mix of experienced soldiers with some green recruits to increase their chances of surviving and earning SP and XP. The new Jericho Thunderbird has slightly more range than the Manticore at the cost of maximum speed, allowing it to reach exploration nodes that might just be out of reach, albeit a little bit slowly. This also ups the squad size to 7, which is a much nicer number to work with if you want to use a vehicle, as it still gives you a variety of options with the soldiers that will accompany it. The Thunderbird is also much more resilient than the Manticore, but it's still not the strongest aircraft. The Disciple of Anu Tiamat, or rather the Blimp, is the slowest moving, longest range, highest durability and highest capacity ship in the game. Holding a max of 8 soldiers, it's unaffected by the capacity change, meaning this is the only vehicle not to require an FAR module for combat deployment. The Blimp will hit mission deployment capacity by itself, with the caveat being, it may never make it to the mission in time. The range can even be further increased with research later in the game, allowing the Tiamat to cross entire oceans, which in very niche circumstances can make it quicker to respond than a Thunderbird, but it's never going to be to Helios. A cool thing to note about the aircraft system is that you aren't restricted in landing only one aircraft at a mission site. If you want full flexibility and squad composition with the fastest response time, use 2 Helios in tandem. This also allows you to have a vehicle and 7 soldiers that you can change out as needed, or leave the vehicle on the ship and just run the 7 soldiers if you want to gain max SP and feel the mission will be straightforward enough without the tank. It plays really well into a composition built around paralysis and capturing Pandorans, allowing you to keep an Aspida ready in the aircraft when you see a dangerous haven defense that might have a larger target that you want, but this still allows you to send a squad of 7 on easier defences and avoid getting your nice shiny vehicle all banged up. This does also mean that, yes, Phoenix Point is a game that will require micromanagement of multiple aircraft on the Geoscape layer. Fortunately, as the game has been patched over time, there are now options available to auto-pause when an aircraft finishes its movement or its exploration, meaning that you don't have to constantly tab select around the globe to make sure people aren't sat idle. It can feel a little overwhelming at first, especially off the back of something like XCOM 2, which gives you missions at a very clear pace. But before long, you'll have 10 craft in the sky, all spaced out sensibly to keep your defensive coverage as solid as you can, and once the entire world is discovered, it basically becomes whack-a-mole. You wait for Pandoran threats to pop up, so you can dispatch the nearest craft and assist and reap the rewards. Or you can go full savage and use your aircraft to raid and pillage a faction that you dislike. You'll be absolutely drowning in resources, but moderation is so out of style at the end of times. I mentioned modules for the aircraft earlier. Each craft can be equipped with 2 weapons and a utility. The FAR module, which increases seating capacity, is classed as a utility. So, whilst deployment aircraft can be armed, it does so at the cost of having a countermeasure or a defensive upgrade. There are 2 other seating capacity modules in Terror from the Void, allowing you the choice between the standard FAR module, which restores stamina whilst in transit, cruise control, which increases aircraft speed, or a fuel tank, which increases the effective range. When you get towards the mid-game, you're far more likely to have the downtime for your teams, which allows them to rest at a Phoenix base rather than having to sleep on the ship. This gives you the opportunity to swap out the FAR module for the cruise control, or, no, let's be honest, you're only going to swap it out for the movement speed bonus. Stop trying to make Geoscape range a thing, it's not going to happen. If you want a defensive option, or your aircraft to deal with the Pandoran air threats, you're going to have quite a lot of options. Although again, being entirely honest, I personally only use one of these upgrades in my games because of the way that the dogfights are designed. The Terror from the Void devs have tried as hard as possible to rebalance aerial combat to make it less off-putting, as it's kinda horrific in vanilla, but there's still generally one tactic which works reliably and it's hit and run. I'll get to that later though. As with ground combat, air combat has a variety of status effects that can be inflicted, most of which work very similar to their counterparts. To deal with each type of aerial weapon, there's a distinct countermeasure. You use flares for heat guiding, afterburner for visually guided, fire suppression systems to stop burning, a security station to counter bioweapons, and an ECM jammer to counter radar guided missiles. Whilst it is nice to be able to completely negate a type of damage, very few Pandoran craft will attack you with only one weapon type, meaning something will always hit you if you use this approach. You also have some more rounded defense modules, which are the reinforced bulkhead for extra durability or the armor plate for extra armor. What you want is extra armor. It lets you ignore most of the direct damage attacks from the Pandoran craft, with their damage over time effects often requiring a closer range to fire. So, you can start a fight, get some shots off, disengage, and rinse and repeat until they're destroyed. Yes, this is undeniably cheap, but the air combat is truly terrible. You're not missing anything by using this technique. The final module is an odd one, the Oracle. It makes your weapon attacks use psychic guidance rather than whatever type they normally would, but this does nothing to boost accuracy. I've never found a use for it. There are, simply put, a huge selection of armaments for your aircraft, and I've already told you what style of combat works best, so you might be able to guess that high range, high accuracy weapons are the best pick. The values for the following section are all taken from the Phoenix Point wiki. These are vanilla variants. Some have already been changed, and others are subject to fluctuation as Terror from the Void is continually being updated and tweaked. They may have been buffed or nerfed since I recorded this. With this in mind, I'll work from the shortest range to the longest, so you get to hear about all the lovely options that will likely get your ship trashed if you try to use them. The closest air weapon you can use is the Arnu Ravager. It's a battering ram. For aerial melee weaponry, it's surprisingly inaccurate. It does, however, hit very quickly once you've engaged an enemy at point blank range and has an absurdly high shock damage value, stun locking an enemy into submission in most cases. Your next selection of weapons are the Arnu Heavy Cannon, affectionately called the Ninurtus Mace, the New Jericho Fury Pod, the Gaffly, and the Fenrir Virophage Rotary Cannon, designed by Phoenix Point themselves. All of these weapons share about the same range and have equally abysmal accuracy, sitting between 50 and 65%. The Heavy Cannon and Fury Pod both fill the same role, with the cannon doing 100 damage 7 burst shots and the Fury Pod dealing 110 damage on 6 burst. Again, not bad, but you don't want to get that close and still miss as often as these weapons do. The Virophage Cannon does roughly the same, but it splits its damage over 60 normal and 60 Virophage on burst 7. But by the time you'll have researched this weapon, however, you'll find that most Pandoran aircraft shrug off that normal damage, and they've got pretty high armour. It makes it far less devastating than it appears on paper. The next weapon in this list falls into a category of its own, the Armageddon AAM, a tactical nuke, which weirdly is something you need to use within medium range. I wouldn't even want to be in the same time zone as the enemy when this thing goes off. It has a huge cooldown, so long in fact that you'll have already reached the effective range and then some before it's ready to even fire in combat. It deals 800 damage and has a 100% chance to hit. This weapon is the definition of overkill, and while it certainly can be effective, there are much safer ways to fight in the sky than using this monster. The next batch of weapons all fall around the same transition zone of medium to long range. You have quite a selection. The Prometheus Incinerator Missile, the Broker Autocannon, the Uruchi Heavy Cannon, the Ashara Bane Catapult, and the Medusa EMP Missile. All of these, besides the autocannon, come with an additional effect. The Incinerator Missile has what I consider to be the bare minimum of acceptable accuracy for air combat, 80%, hitting for a solid amount of damage and burning the target. It's simply let down by its lower range. The Broker Autocannon is unfortunate in its accuracy, moderate damage at best with the usual downside that middling range brings. The Orochi Cannon has fantastic shock and high damage, similar to a heavy soldier's Hell 2 cannon. Its awful accuracy again lets it down as the shock regularly misses and leaves you open to damage. The Ashara Bane sounds cool, an aerial bioweapon. Its accuracy and the ammo capacity, however, is beyond a joke. It's not even worth considering. The Medusa AAM is actually something that I could get behind, on the high end of medium range at 1400, with that minimum acceptability of 80% accuracy and the useful effect of disabling the system it hits with a blast of EMP. Whilst this weapon might not be something to aim for, I wouldn't immediately scrap it if I acquired a ship with one on. You can actually work it into some smaller dogfights. This final tier is what you want, the long range weapons. You have the option of the Nomad AAM, the Hand of Tyr missile, the Marauder railgun, the Artemis laser gun, and the Thunderbolt heavy cannon. Despite these weapons being the longest range, they also hit my minimum acceptable accuracy of 80%. So, you outrange the enemy and more regularly land your shots. Win-win, right? The Nomad AAM is the Phoenix starting gear. It isn't anything standout, but it does the job that it needs to. Solid damage, additional shred for heavily armoured targets, and a viable recharge time. The Hand of Tyr sounds biblical, and it kind of is. Like a Nomad on steroids. Huge damage, massive shock, decent accuracy and acceptable range. It's hard to see how it's beaten, right? Well, we've still got a few more weapons to see, so let's keep going. The Marauder Railgun is the new Jericho starting tech, and honestly, I use it pretty much the entire game until I get my hand on the weapon of choice. Its biggest upside is that it ignores armour. It allows it to rapidly destroy Pandoran ship parts, meaning you can destroy anything that bypasses or pierces your armoured aircraft, then safely sit and tank the damage that they throw at you as you destroy them in peace. The Artemis laser gun is Synedrion's basic weaponry, and is another choice to equip for most of the game. The damage is quite low, but it fires insanely fast with near perfect accuracy, has the highest range in the game. It can chip away at enemies and destroy them before you need to get into range. The only issue with this weapon is that it will get outclassed by enemy ships at some point. The damage simply isn't enough to keep up with Pandoran tech advancements. The final weapon is my choice. The Thunderbolt HC9. It's a big old electro laser that has the best of everything. High base damage, armor shred, massive range, a quick cooldown, 95% accuracy. A couple of these on your ship with an armor module and you're laughing. The only Pandoran that will even scratch you is one that has a void chamber. Everything else is dusted before it even makes it into range to fire on you. You may still need to do a bit of engage, disengage even with these weapons if you want to avoid taking any damage in a fight, but they make everything in the sky a freebie. Lovely floating resource rewards. Happy hunting. Now, I've talked a lot on soldiers, vehicles, exploration, enemies, but what about establishing Phoenix Point? What exactly do you do with your operation? When you start the game, you are given a single base with a standard layout. Over time, you're expected to expand and open new bases, which in turn expands your scanner coverage and helps you keep the Pandoran threat to a minimum. You may notice as the game progresses a red mist begins to spread and cover the majority of the planet. This is the threat that you're dealing with. Pandorans operate under the cover of the mist. It strengthens their attacks. It chokes any havens caught within it, causing their population to fall, and, should one of your bases be covered by it, it will cause it to become infested, meaning that you'll have to fight to make it operational again. In its most basic form, that's what Phoenix Point is about. Investigate the mist, stop the Pandoran threat, you play World Police, it's simple. The bases you unlock will come with a random assortment of buildings. However, you'll likely want to specialise your bases and ensure that all of them are equipped with the bare minimum to support your efforts. So, let's go over what you can build. All bases have a vehicle bay. This repairs your ground and air vehicles over time when stationed at the base and allows you to support additional craft. It is unlikely that you'll ever need to reach the maximum capacity of 36 planes, as it's simply an absurd amount. However, it is basically a free increase with every base that you restore. The next buildings are what I would call your core 4. These should be built in every base regardless of its purpose for the simple sake of utility and consistency. You'll want a satellite uplink. This slowly expands a search area out around the base once built, revealing exploration points and allowing you to discover Pandoran bases that are within the radar range after Pandorans have attacked a haven. If the attack comes from outside of your scanner range, you will not be able to retaliate against the base and they will likely attack again soon. The energy generator is a necessity. It provides power to support your other buildings, and at the start of the game it can generate 20 units of electricity. With a little research, this increases to 30, so one generator is usually more than enough to support an entire base. Building 2 is overkill, as you can simply open another base in the early game if you need more construction space, whilst waiting on the technology to become available. The living quarters and med bay are the remaining buildings of this core 4, which both support the R&R needs of your soldiers. The The living quarters allows you to accommodate more troops and removes fatigue, while the med bay slowly heals wounds. If you're going to be resting soldiers at a base to fix one of their bars, you might as well fix the other. Next, you have your production line facilities, including the research lab, fabrication plant, food production, mutation lab, cybernetics lab, and an archaeology lab. It sounds like a lot, but they're actually very straightforward. I tend to build my bases focused, which isn't required, but it makes managing them easier at a glance. So I tend to keep each type of building, sans the cybernetic lab, as you only need one of those, stacked in a single base or two. Your research lab does what you'd expect. It generates research for you. Whilst the number itself is hidden, there is a numerical value to research in Phoenix Point, so each lab will generate a certain number of research points per turn, and every research has a cost of X points. It's why sometimes you get rewarded 100 research from exploration events. The Cybernetics lab unlocks access to cybernetic augmentation for Phoenix soldiers, and also acts as a research lab. There is no reason to build more than one, but they also cost exactly the same as a research lab and offer the same effect, plus augmentation. So if you prefer the look of the cybernetic building, by all means, use it instead. A note for augmentation. The soldier does not need to be present at the base in which the lab is built to be augmented. Phoenix soldiers work within the realms of quantum superposition. They're able to be in two places at once, and when required, can grab gear from anywhere else in the world if they need it. It's better not to ask questions sometimes. Your fabrication plant is what makes this quantum tunneling gear. Again, like the lab, there is a hidden fabrication point value, and every item you build has a base value. The more fabrication points you have, the bigger percentage reduction in time it will take to build. For both research and fabrication, I tend to aim for 12 of each by the time that I reach endgame. Any more is a little needless, but if you're rolling in resources, go as crazy as you want. I typically find that 2 bases dedicated to research and another 2 for production is more than enough to support an entire globe's worth of soldiers for most campaigns. The food production plant is very useful. Not only does it allow you to offset the daily drain of food resources needed to keep your soldiers in top shape, but it also gives you access to a constant flow of a tradable resource. Depending on when you get food production will determine entirely how useful this is. It could be very late game already, and you don't have much time to put it to work. However, it could be nice and early and allow you to stockpile thousands of additional food, which lets you trade for materials and tech to buy more bases, hire more soldiers, snowball harder into a victory. As a quick note for trading, Arnu gives the most food, New Jericho gives the most material, and Sinedrian gives the most tech. So you'll need to find a haven that has the resource you want to buy, but doesn't have the resource you want to sell for the best result. You'll likely want at least one base making food full time. If you can get it early enough and afford the investment, 2 bases making food will allow you to unlock your entire library of Phoenix bases with the resources you can get via trade. The Mutation Lab works similarly to food production, sans the tradable part. It gives you a steady stream of mutagens to spend on your Mutoids, Mutogs, Mutations. It's far too many Mews. Your mutation options will unlock when you build one of these buildings. How many labs you want is entirely down to how you're building your teams and what you enjoy using. I really enjoy playing with Mutoids and messing with the silly skill combinations, so I tend to lean towards 2 full bases of these, churning out a huge amount of mutagens for me to throw into the grinder, making prime pod people whenever I feel like it. The final part of production is the Archaeology Lab. These do quite a lot, but they're only important if you want to interact with the Ancients DLC. The lab itself allows for production of archaeology probes. The more labs you have, the cheaper the probes will be. What are the probes for? Well, you need them to scout for archaeological sites, which means you need to saturate the entire globe with them. And you'll need quite a few to paint the entire world so you can find all of these sites. But once you've found the sites and claimed them, the labs also make it cheaper to excavate the ruins and increase the production of the ancient resources. So this single building does do quite a lot. The ancient tech is some of the strongest weaponry in the game, but it does require a fairly heavy investment, not in terms of just time, but also in terms of risk, as the Guardians are very strong. This building can be ignored, and I regularly skip the Ancients content as I really dislike the enemies, but if you want to see how crazy the game can be with some truly devastating gear, you might want to load a base full of these and scout the world. It's fun. Once. The remaining buildings all serve a more specific purpose. First, we've got something that you should never build yourself, and always deconstruct if you ever open a base with one present: the access lift. This will actively hamper your team during a defense mission, as it positions you further inside your own base and splits your squad. Without it, your squad will spawn in a central room together, ready to face the threat through a natural choke. Don't build these. The next building is the storeroom. It stores. You have a global capacity for everything inventory related. Medkits, grenade, spare ammo, armour, weapons, it all feeds into this. If you keep your stores clear and dismantle additional items that you don't need for spare resources, you'll never need a very big stockpile capacity. But it's always nice to have a little bit extra. I usually keep my capacity at 600 max, but I honestly don't think I've ever gone above 400 in any of my playthroughs. You'd need to be seriously hoarding to hit those kinds of numbers, or doing a lot of raids on other factions for all of their goodies. The training facility is a key building. You want a single base, somewhere central, easily accessible, absolutely saturated with these. The bases located at either Algeria, Afghanistan or China are the best suited. Every training facility in a base will give all of the soldiers inside, regardless of if they're assigned to an aircraft or in the base itself, 2 XP per hour. Now, that doesn't sound a lot by itself. Consider that you can stack this buff. If you're lucky with a base layout and the debris isn't blocking access to any open spaces, you can comfortably fit 10 of these, netting 20 XP an hour, which means that in under 1 in-game week, a level 1 recruit will be ready to hit their Geoscape at max level in under 5 days. Let me say that again. Level 1 to max in under 5 days, with 0 missions required. Now, the soldier will admittedly be pretty trash. You'll have only earned the SP that they would normally get from leveling up, and be able to afford the bare minimum of stats and abilities. But it's a damn sight better than the level 1 that you had 5 days ago, right? You only need 1 of these bases running, and you'll be thankful that you do, as they're expensive to set up. They're essential if you want to field a lot of soldiers without the risk of sending large amounts of green soldiers into the field to be butchered. Speaking of being butchered, you can also build a Pandoran containment facility. This is a required building to advance the story, as it allows you to bring paralysed Pandorans back to the base for study. Each containment has 50 space, with larger units, like a Chiron or a Scylla, taking up considerably more space once captured. While you do only need 1, if you're going heavy on the paralyze, it might be worth building a second just to make sure you can get all of the crabby boys home. With a little bit of research, you open up additional options for Pandorans that are contained. To begin with, you'll be able to vivisect the subject to gain a better understanding of their physiology, usually resulting in a damage bonus. Later in the game, you can turn Pandorans into food, like crab claws or fish sticks. Later still, you can blend the Pandorans into a mutagen smoothie and use it to enhance your own soldiers, or build new mutoids. A very useful addition indeed, which explains why Paralysis is such an expensive route to take on missions, costing a large chunk of tech in ammo after deployment. This helps offset it somewhat. The final building is extremely important if you want to actually protect the globe. The Mist Repeller. I'd say this should technically fall into the core 4, but it's normally a good couple of in-game months before you unlock the repeller tech, so you'll be adding it to existing bases, not building bases with it to start. The repeller lives up to its name. It clears the mist around the base that it's constructed in, spreading outwards similarly to the scan from a satellite, just a smaller radius. Keeping friendly havens within the range of your mist repellers is vital to stop them hemorrhaging citizens and slowly dying to the mist's influence. It also greatly helps on haven defences, as with no mist coverage, Pandorans will find it more difficult to hide for you on deployment. As the tech is a Sanhedrin exclusive, it is well worth considering staying on their good side until this is unlocked. Otherwise, you might have to run a few technology steal missions to claim it, and Synedrian are not a nice faction to assault, having the sneakiest and highest ranged operatives in the game. They love breaking limbs and picking on weak squaddies. If you have to annoy somebody, consider annoying the Disciples of Anu. They have the worst armour and love getting into melee range. Admittedly, if you go this route instead, you'll need to steal the food and mutation tech. The other option is New Jericho, and after my experience with their heavy soldiers and the multiple salvos they fire from their mounted rockets, I'll pass on ever upsetting them again, thank you very much. If you're careful with your diplomacy and choices, especially in Terror from the Void as the penalties are larger, you might be able to sweet talk your way into unlocking all of the buildings before the penalties from the Civil War stacks too high and forces your hand in making an enemy or two. Personally, I'd say prioritise the repeller tech. It keeps people alive rather than stacking resources, and you'll be able to earn this by defending the havens which you're now keeping alive by saving them from the mist. That makes sense, yeah? Section 4. The Leftovers. Crab sticks don't contain any crab to begin with, so why not use Arthrons? I mentioned a few times throughout this video augmentations and mutations as well as the factions that use them, so let's do a quick deep dive into what is actually available to you with these technologies. You have 3 tiers of mutation and augmentation technology and 3 head mutations tied to unlocking the Priest class. It might be incorrect to call them tiers, however, as parts from the ultimate mutation technology aren't strictly better than the initial mutation tech. Everything has a specific role and a purpose to fulfill, with the higher tier usually offering something a little more niche that requires additional thought for a specific skill to benefit from. Both mutations and augmentations can only be applied to 2 of the 3 parts of a soldier, as a full 3 of 3 would result in a total loss of humanity. When picking which 2 body parts, it's important to remember you can mix and match between different tiers of tech, as well as having a mutated head and augmented legs, for example. Body parts that have been modified also lose support for the module slot on the soldier, meaning you need to plan ahead with what bonuses you gain and also lose access to. Once you've applied a mutation or augmentation, you're also locked into that type of modification for that slot. You can remutate or re-augment, but you cannot swap to the other side, nor can you return to human limbs. Those bits were thrown in the bin when they gave you a shiny new head. As mentioned in the class section, the Priest unlocks 3 unique heads, which are core to the class itself. The Judgment, Screaming and Synod head all offer a bonus will point to the Priest which allows them to better use their early abilities, such as Mind Control and Panic, without requiring a huge investment into their willpower stat directly. The Judgment head offers the Frenzy buff, which increases friendly movement speed, making them immune to panic. This is widely considered the obvious choice for the Priest head as it gives the most impactful boon. The Screaming head allows you to use a Psychic Scream and lower all nearby enemies' will points. Whilst this can be useful against large groups of human enemies that are easier to panic, the Priest is usually a very squishy class, especially with this head only offering 12 armour, so getting close enough to use it is questionable. The final head, Synod, gives you a will point restoration AoE effect for all allies, so if you run 2 priests in a team, or use very high impact abilities, you may want to consider this buff as it doesn't take long to add up when hitting multiple characters, and allows for a free sustained mind control on smaller enemy units like an Arthron, without draining the priest's will points. The first tier of mutation tech unlocks the Krabby style parts. The head offers Daze immunity, useful for shrugging off shock or completely ignoring sonic screams. The chest allows for regeneration across all injured body parts, restoring broken limbs as long as the torso remains intact. It also offers fire resistance, which, given the high armour of these parts, is practically fire immunity unless you've taken a lot of shred damage. The legs allow the soldier to stomp and confer a solid bonus to accuracy given the stable nature of the feat. The stomp itself is somewhat lackluster, with a small daze value that only works against somewhat trivial enemies or those that are already in bad shape. As this tier of mutation is focused around high armour, be careful to keep the unmodified part of the soldier well protected, as the AI usually aims for the weakest part of the body to try and punish you. so having 30 armour on your legs and torso is pointless when you're wearing a helmet that only gives you 12. It'll be Headshot City. Population, you. The second tier offers some sleek, squishy, fishy bits. The Perceptor head gives a huge perception bonus, as well as enhancing accuracy. This makes it difficult for sneaky enemy units to evade you, so you're less likely to be blindsided by a Triton sniper. The Tentacle Torso gives you access to a huge paralysing melee attack, hitting for 24 paralysis damage. This also allows you to retaliate with your tentacles when hit in melee or shot by an adjacent enemy. Whilst typically you don't want to be getting hit at all with this torso, as it is insanely fragile, it works very well against Myrmidons that come out of nowhere to dive bomb you off of a rooftop, generally leaving them exhausted for the rest of the turn and giving you an easy follow-up on your next move. The Shadow Legs are made for stealth and have another weak shock damage based attack in the form of an electric kick. Again, these body parts are fragile. I wouldn't trust this kick at all when I've got the option to slap something with paralysis instead, so as cheap as the kick is, just be aware of how pathetic the impact may be. The last tier is some straight up Cthulhu nonsense. The Resistor head reduces poison and virus damage by half, which isn't particularly interesting and also plays into the bad habit of expecting to take damage and reduce it rather than avoiding damage altogether. Yes, sometimes you've got to take a hit, but on a 20 armor headpiece? Pass. The Venom Torso is such a meme that I genuinely adore it. Terror from the Void also fixed it by giving it unlimited ammunition. It replaces your soldier's arm with a poison spike launching cannon. It barely even does average damage, and it strips you of the ability to use a two-handed weapon, so someone with this torso is now a pistol or melee only fighter. On the plus side, it gives you a big accuracy boost, and with the right support, the poison spikes function very similarly to the Venom crossbow, only costing 1 AP to fire and letting you put huge stacking dots on targets. You just need to figure out how to survive a couple of turns as you wait for them to die to it. It's stupid, it's definitely nowhere near the meta, but make a team of 6 that use them and have a laugh. It's kind of fun. The Agile Legs in this tier are a solid choice for a glass cannon, only offering 10 armor but giving a huge +4 speed and immunity to goo. They work amazingly with the Berserker when you're keeping them buffed and supported, and can equally work well on a sniper to allow them to get the most movement out of their single AP before they need to use the remaining 3 to fire their weapon. Just stay away from incendiaries, they break almost instantly. For augmentations, all of these parts have bleed immunity, viral, poison and paralysis resistance, but take massively increased damage from acid. If an augmented soldier is hit by acid, it is often the case that they will die within 2 turns if you do not evacuate them, so be extremely careful with what you use a bionic soldier against. Tier 1 is the tanky set, featuring the Clarity head which has mind control immunity and high armour. This is great on a heavy that you want to keep forward, as Sirens and Fraggers can't suddenly jump and take away your meat shield. The Juggernaut Torso has the highest armour of any gear available to the player in the game. It also features an energy shield which can protect you from a rather narrow direction, and the ability to enter Demolition State, which will see you channel Vinnie Jones, going headfirst through walls, making your own path. It is worth mentioning that the shield for the Pure does not cost them an AP to use, whereas Phoenix soldiers will have to pay to activate it. Your soldier also doesn't take a knee like a soldier using a ballistic shield does, so the energy shield leaves a larger portion of your body uncovered and vulnerable to damage. The shield is, however, entirely capable of fully soaking blast damage, poison spits, and can even save you from acid blasts. Potentially, that is. You may still get unlucky with how the blast spreads. The Armadillo Legs give you immunity to goo and landing shock absorption, a unique effect that completely removes all fall damage from a unit. This is another bonus that plays well with an aggressive heavy. If you find yourself regularly landing on rooftops to scout the map, only to be sent tumbling through the building because enemies have used explosives on you, this may help mitigate some of the damage. You'll still need to deal with the damage of the explosion though. Tier 2 gives what I consider the support set. offering a suite of abilities that can augment classes with abilities outside of their usual playstyle. The Disruptor head is low armour, high accuracy, with the insanely useful skill Neural Disruption. The Disruption effect renders the target unable to use will point abilities for the next turn and cancels any channeled effects, such as Mind Control. Keeping a sniper in the back with this ability can be key to pressuring a Scylla, saving a squad member or forcing an enemy to make a suboptimal choice. The Neural Torso has the odd benefit of Heavy Lifter, which doubles the weight a soldier can carry, but it doesn't expand your inventory, so you'll need to be carrying a really heavy payload to make use of it. The bigger bonus is the addition of the mounted weapon rack on the back, allowing the wearer to use heavy launchers or the technician arms. This can supplement classes that don't want to be weighed down with heavy armour, but still want access to rocket salvos. Super useful. The propeller legs are a mishmash of a Berserker and a Heavy. They give you great speed with a small rocket leap ability, fantastic for mobility whilst not being as fragile as the Agile leg mutation. These can work well on assaults or Berserkers that you're trying to play a little bit safer with. The final tier is Light, stealth options. As they're still cybernetics, they aren't as fragile as you might initially think. The Echo head has a fantastic unique effect on top of a nice accuracy boost. It grants the soldier night vision, and Silent Echo, meaning your perception isn't hard when deploying in the dark and all weapon attacks are made silent. I have no idea how a head modification silences a sniper rifle. I can only imagine it emits some kind of scream that's louder than the gunshot and just confuses the enemy. This head modification is what you want to allow your infiltrator to stay hidden when using a weapon that isn't a crossbow. Whilst firing an unsilenced weapon doesn't immediately reveal the unit, Pandorans will usually do their best to uncover or harass a soldier that is appearing to them as a red dot. This keeps you safe and allows you to harass the enemy with whatever firearms you prefer. The Vengeance Torso is the melee powerhouse option, granting proficiency with melee weapons and reducing the cost of swinging them to only 1 AP, so it straightforward doubles your damage output in most cases and allows you to sneak a cheeky hit in for others. If playing vanilla, this is the augmentation that allows you for the broken 1-turn clear build. Terror from the Void has fixed this by changing how rapid clearance works. For those who are unaware what the build consisted of, you pair this torso with rapid clear. It allowed you to restore 2 AP for every enemy killed. With your melee only costing 1 AP, you would regularly find that you earned AP rather than spent it on every kill, especially with a high damage melee weapon like the Scyther from the Ancients DLC. If you stacked enough movement buffs on a soldier and managed their ability usage well, you could, on 1 turn, move around the entire map and completely wipe it of enemies, with it being even easier to do so against human opponents. There are plenty of videos out there, I'm sure, of people doing this technique if you would like a more detailed look. Personally, I'm glad it's been rebalanced with the change to rapid clearance. It now allows for more functionality on the Assault class without having to use this tactic. The legs in this tier are the Mirage legs, with another fantastic unique bonus. Not only do they have great accuracy and a very thin profile, making it hard for some enemies to shoot your legs, it also grants the Shadow Step buff, meaning you can run through the enemy Overwatch zone without triggering them. This allows you to have a soldier dedicated to flushing out or disabling enemy threats that try to use Overwatch with 0 risk. Always a good option to have in the back pocket, especially with how strong later Arthron guns can become. So those are your mutations and augmentations. A lot of choices. Some great, others not so much, and all with the possibility of making your soldiers look like an absolute clown fiesta. I definitely recommend giving everything a try at least once, even if I've stated that some of the effects, such as Electric Kick on the Shadow legs, are a little lackluster. It gives you a much better understanding of what the enemies are bringing to the fight when the Pure or the Forsaken turn up with these body parts and use them against you. Whilst I mentioned weapons earlier, as there were a vast array of damage types to cover, I did skip over some of the equipment, some of the armour that you can wear, and the modules that are attached to body parts. It doesn't warrant a whole deep dive or a highly detailed section, but there are a few useful things to know. Your standard medkit is the most important bit of equipment in the game as far as I'm concerned. The only soldier I wouldn't carry one on is the Technician, and that's because they have their support arms to heal others. Over time, you'll unlock research which further improves your medkit, allowing it to heal for more and also remove some of the paralysis as well as clearing bleeding and poison status. The stage up from the medkit is the Virophage kit, which is considerably more expensive, but also removes virus and heals 200 by default. This kit is likely to be something you don't see until quite late game, so you may have enough resources to comfortably move everybody over to using it instead. Personally, I only take them in the final mission. Normal medkits do the job for me the majority of the time. The repair kit is the augmented version of the medkit, made to get a bionic soldier back in the fight. And being entirely honest, I've never used one. At 150 materials and 75 tech, they are insanely expensive. I think you're supposed to expend these to try and offset the cost of needing to fix any damage inflicted to an augmented body part after deployment, but it's easier to just pay the cost at the end of the mission instead, rather than trying to time the use of this correctly. A strange bit of kit that you unlock quite early is the combat shield. Relatively cheap to produce with high armour, good HP, this is your solution for discovering Tritons use guns. I've used them in a couple of campaigns, including a no-death legend run and a Phoenix Gear only run. While they certainly do have a function, they aren't the most reliable because of how poorly your soldiers obscure their profile behind the shield. If a Pandoran has any elevation, or is even on even ground with your soldier, their head will poke completely above the top of the shield, and they leave one side almost fully exposed, similar to an Arthron. However, if you have height advantage when using these, they can completely cover your soldier from head to toe with a solid 90 degrees of protection from incoming fire, especially effective if you use it at waist high cover to further protect your flank, or even better, angle it correctly to protect your exposed side with a solid wall. The other benefit that a shield offers is that whilst it's in your active bar, not your backpack, providing you with a turtle shell. This has saved my soldiers from taking damage potentially more times than deploying the shield did. Arthrons waste poison spits into it, Triton hitmen quietly seethe as their bullet harmlessly bounces off the alloy, and it may even be lucky enough to completely ignore a nearby worm that exploded behind you, harmlessly splashing its insides against the shield. It is the very definition of a niche item, and I can see why some players value it highly, especially during the early game when you might not have high HP. A weapon that every class can use regardless of proficiency and training, as it is technically classed as equipment, is the Neurazer. It's likely to be your earliest mass-produced option to paralyse Pandorans, requiring you to get your soldier into melee range to deliver a dose of horse tranquilizer. While it may not be a great deal of paralysis per hit, it does only cost 1 AP, so with smart use of an assault, it can be passed between soldiers freely, allowing multiple operatives to gang up on a tanky target and repeatedly jab it until it succumbs to slumber. I find it very useful to always keep these in the backpacks of my assaults, as you never know when a new Pandoran may turn up to complete your collection. Gotta catch 'em all. They're also very useful for quickly dealing with worms if you're tight on AP and need to keep moving. Might as well take it for free instead of just splattering it. The final bit of equipment you can build is something I've never really found a use for, the Stim Pack. It's portable frenzy on demand for 2 AP. The only issue is that you don't really want to use this with the soldier that you want frenzy on. You're already wasting 2 AP of boosted movement to activate the effect, which has a relatively short duration, which means you want another soldier to be carrying this to support your damage dealer that benefits from the frenzy. But then the question becomes, why use a stim pack for this when you could just take a priest, or multiclass someone into a priest, or train a mutoid to have frenzy? It has such a tiny application of situations where it might be useful that I have never found the slot that this fits into cleanly. It would be useful on a technician that is more offensively focused. Maybe they've multiclassed into an assault already and there just isn't a priest in the squad, but you'd like the frenzy effect on your Berserker to help them get into melee range easier. Maybe that's where it's supposed to be used? My question is though, if you've got an offensively focused technician and a Berserker, why is that team then lacking a priest? Even if they were recently lost on a mission, a level 1 priest could still be given the frenzy head to apply the buff to the entire squad as soon as you spawn. I'm sure this thing makes sense somewhere, I just don't know where. It even comes from Arnu technology, which means you have to be friendly with them to unlock this, so you already have access to the priest by the time this research is complete. Armour in Phoenix Point is fluid. Any class can use any armour almost without limitation. Soldiers need heavy training to use mounted weapons and the heavy armour jump pack, but they also require technician training to use tech arms. Outside of this, you can wear whatever you like. You can still put the Berserker in heavy armour without the training and they'll benefit from the improved defences. They just won't be launching themselves across the map to dive into combat unless they multi-class. There is some overlap for classes, namely the starting classes, with the specialist classes only getting one set of armour designed for them. Bandits will wear the worst gear in this game, with stats a step down from the standard Phoenix Point gear, which is baseline for the equipment offering very simple bonuses. You'll be looking at armour, perception, stealth, accuracy and speed bonuses on gear. Armour is self-explanatory. The higher the value, the more damage it mitigates. Perception increases the radius that your soldier can spot an enemy, which requires an uninterrupted sightline. No wall hacks in this game. Stealth reduces your detection radius with positive values, and increases the detection radius with negative. Negative stealth allows an enemy with low perception to spot you at a higher range. High positive stealth will allow you to stay hidden, even from enemies like Tritons with double perception. There is a limit to stealth that is 5 tiles. Regardless of how high your stealth stat is, even if you hit over 100%, you will always be spotted within a 5 tile radius. The Infiltrator class is also required to make effective use of stealth as a mechanic. This is never really explained to the player. They get a much clearer indication in Terror from the Void with colour-coded warnings on the nameplate to show if you're concealed, compromised, or revealed. Accuracy works the same as stealth. A positive number increases the effective range of your weapon, negative values lower it. This can lead to some surprising revelations about certain weapons, particularly heavy gear. The heavy armour in this game is usually loaded with negative stealth and accuracy modifiers, making the weapons that they use appear clunky and practically only useful in melee ranges. A soldier wearing high accuracy gear using a Hell 2 cannon will see a huge shift in effective range, as they boosted a negative multiplier to a positive. While I wouldn't recommend trying to snipe with heavy cannons, it is worth remembering that heavy armour is doing a lot to punish the effective range of your weapons. Speed is another simple bonus, straight plus or negative that plays directly into your soldier's speed stat. Light, agile legs will offer less protection but allow you to move freely. Big chunky ceramic plates will stop you from ducking and diving but happily soak small arms fire. The factions all have their own approach to armour, with specialist classes further having a focus. All assault gear is the most basic you could expect, with Phoenix Assault Armour offering a lovely flat 0000 on the chest piece. Just armour, very simple. New Jericho leans further towards defensive options, lowering the stealth value of the armour in favour of higher armour. Synedrian values accuracy over protection, lowering the armour on all of their pieces for a small bonus to accuracy and a tiny additional bonus to speed on the chest piece. Arnu takes this even further, forgoing armour almost entirely and fighting in religious robes, offering no accuracy bonus but a boost to speed and perception, keeping their assaults mobile and aware of their surroundings. As the Disciples of Arnu don't use snipers or heavy classes, they produce no armour for either. Synedrian also doesn't use heavy soldiers. So, the armour produced for snipers follows a similar formula for assault gear, with factions showing their strengths. As the sniper outfit is loaded with optics and stabilising supports, it's typically going to lower mobility for a soldier compared to assault gear, with the New Jericho armour being the heaviest and toughest, offering a middle ground for accuracy and solid perception, but no bonus stealth. The Phoenix gear again is very standard, only costing a small amount of movement to wear, with a slight bonus to stealth and accuracy, plus a tiny amount of extra perception. The Synedrian gear is perfectly designed for long-range encounters and camping somewhere safe, granting the largest bonus to accuracy, stealth, and perception for only a minimal movement penalty, at the risk of wearing next to no actual armour in the field. Since only New Jericho and Phoenix use heavy classes, this one is simple. The New Jericho armour is better in almost every regard, adding a bigger penalty to stealth and perception at a dramatic boost to armour, which is what the heavy's all about. They both come with built-in short-range jump packs and an add-on slot to attach a heavy launcher between the soldier's shoulder blades. These launchers are quick to use, with limited ammo, but can turn the tide if you hit a cluster of enemies. It is always worth considering that taking a heavy out of their armour dramatically changes their playstyle, when multiclassing another soldier into heavy can dramatically broaden the scope of theirs. The Berserker Gear is produced by the Disciples of Anu, and as you'd expect, it's about as effective as wearing paint into battle. It greatly increases speed, some of the best increases on gear available to the player without augmentation or mutation, and it raises perception to assist the soldier with avoiding ambushes. It does so at the cost of accuracy and all armour, offering the lowest protection in the game with 10 on the weakest part and 14 on the strongest. This is your glass cannon and is all about going fast. Synedrian makes the Infiltrator Gear, and it does one thing very, very well, which is staying hidden and scouting. The best stealth values as you'd expect, and very high perception. This armour leaves the soldier's mobility entirely unaffected and offers no assistance to aim. It does offer what could be called minimal protection at best, so maintaining your undercover status is definitely the plan when wearing this gear. By itself, the gear hits 50% stealth, with the Infiltrator class adding a further 25% by default. A 75% stealth stat will be fine for avoiding almost all enemies besides the most observant Triton. If you want to push it further to try and hit the cap, you'll need the Thief perk for another 25%. Alternatively, you can swap the legs for the stealth mutation and reach 85% comfortably. Just remember to swap the head out for the Echo augmentation if you plan to use a weapon besides the crossbow. The Technician gets a solid set of armour developed by New Jericho, somewhere between an assault and a heavy. It exchanges a penalty to speed and stealth for a bonus to accuracy and survivability, with a rounded 25 armour across the board. The Technician torso also has a module on the back allowing for attaching tech arms to support the team and provide healing and repairs where needed. In most cases, the chest piece is a must as many of the Technician's skills play into using the tech arms. The Priest only has a torso and leg slot available as they're expected to mutate their heads to perform their class role. The Priest armour is also the only chest and leg piece in the game that can increase perception, better enhancing a soldier's senses so they can tell where the enemy is just by the vibe. It also offers a small amount of accuracy and, as with all Anu gear, practically no defense. Possibly the most specialised gear in the game, as such high perception is rarely required, especially on a soldier that is attacking from virus rifle range and wants to be close enough to the team to support with their abilities. To further support your armour, you'll get opportunities to research and build modules as the game progresses. There are only a few options, but all are cheap and very quick to produce, so you absolutely should throw them on when possible to better protect your team. Head modules include a multivisual sensor, aka night vision goggles, which allow you to ignore the 50% perception debuff when fighting at night. A motion detection module, which is the Priest's skill Psychic Sense, but available for all soldiers, allowing you to sense enemies behind solid walls, on the floor beneath or above you, or even hiding in mist. Highly useful for close range units that you don't want to be caught off guard by a surprising third party. The Clarity Helmet, but as of writing this I still haven't tested it, I'm fairly certain this has been fixed in Terror from the Void, this used to do absolutely nothing in vanilla however, is supposed to reduce the effect of psychic screams by half, hindering Terror Sentinels and Sirens from panicking your party. The final module is a Repeller, which is a tiny, portable version of the Mist Repeller that you can build in your base. I picture it looking like one of those caps with a propeller on top for some reason. It allows you to run into the mist clouds and clear them as you go, removing the risk of a will point debuff for characters who end the turn in mist and stopping the Pandorans having easy access for hiding places. The torso slot has 3 options. All of them work the same but for different damage types. You have a blast resistance, fire resistance, and poison resistance vest. You may want to use the fire resistance vest on your close range units if you also employ a lot of incendiary tactics to allow them to engage without breaking all of their limbs when moving across the battlefield. I personally find the blast resistance to be the most useful. Not only does it lower the overall damage of explosives, but it stops a soldier being completely crippled whenever a grenade goes off near them, as it also reduces the limb damage. A fantastic and very cheap investment. These torso modules do use the same slot as a heavy mounted launcher or technician support arms, so you'll need to keep that in mind as enemies may pick on a soldier without the resistance if they want to be especially cruel. There is only one module at time of writing for the leg slot, the Goo Repeller, which frees your soldiers' feet when enemies bombard you with big blobs of green goop and allows them to stay mobile. The hardest part of getting this module is that you need to kill an enemy with the Goo ability to unlock the research that then wants you to capture a Pandoran with Goo. If you capture the Goo Pandoran first, it won't let you do the research. So you'll need to do at least 2 missions with Goo before you can ignore it. This module alone entirely negates a Goo Chiron, so you can see how valuable it is to earn as soon as possible. I want to talk quite briefly about the tech tree without directly going into every individual research project bit by bit, so I'm going to talk broadly for the first time in the entire video, albeit briefly. I mentioned at the top that Phoenix Point is a horizontal tech tree, which is part of the reason that I enjoy it. This may be a strange term to some people, so I'll try and better explain it here. While there are some pieces of equipment in-game that are straight better than others, pound for pound, broadly speaking, when you start your journey, everything new that you find will be a sidestep or an alternative approach. You can research new assault rifles by working with New Jericho or Synedrian. New Jericho will give you a rifle that hits harder, but fires less rounds per burst and has worse accuracy. Synedrian will give you a weapon that does exactly the same damage as a Phoenix assault rifle and has better accuracy, at the cost of far more expensive ammunition. Arnu don't touch assault rifles, so if you work with them, they'll give you a shotgun. This is the idea of a horizontal tree. You're given options, not necessarily upgrades. You also never have a huge leap in technology by completing a single piece of research. There isn't some magic discovery to be made that's going to double your damage or suddenly pump all of your soldiers' health to ludicrous numbers. You'll get percentage bonuses here and there, an additional 10% damage to Arthrons, 15% more damage to Sentinels. So while these upgrades don't sound mind-blowing, you're much more grateful to receive them, as even a small bonus can give you that little extra push needed to reach a damage threshold, making a shot from a weapon which previously almost did enough to break a limb, now able to achieve it. It keeps you at a slow and steady pace of progression alongside the Pandoran's evolution, meaning you need to rely on the skills of your soldiers, the synergy within your team, and your knowledge of what the enemy can do to win. The Pandorans, however, will always gain much bigger improvements. They get entirely new variants, they have greater numbers than you, and they progress much faster throughout the campaign. The game makes it hard to brute force beyond this, and it's what I've always loved about how the technology is laid out. I've played turn-based tactics before which have a problem of, this game is difficult and engaging until I unlock X problem, where the early missions are engaging and tense because the numbers are all well tuned, but all of that is lost when you straight double a soldier's damage output or survivability. You can't time an upgrade like that accurately for all players, as it'll either come too late, meaning enemies are twice as powerful as you whilst you're working towards it, or you'll get it far too early and immediately steamroll the enemies that were previously supposed to be a threat to you, allowing you to snowball in experience and never looking back. Unless you're obviously already very good at the game, you should never feel like any mission is a complete given with Phoenix Point. You might be able to walk in with a degree of nonchalance as it's listed as low threat, or you're rocking your A-team, but you're only ever really one bad decision away from making the mission take a complete turn, potentially even into a doom spiral, especially if there's dangerous enemies waiting in the wings to swoop down and wipe the map of all human life. Phoenix Point also makes an effort to spread its tech tree across the factions, so who you start near and who you initially favour can rather dramatically shift what you have access to early on. You may never be offered some technology without a little violent persuasion if you upset a faction from the outset. This then plays into your research team at Phoenix, bringing the best of both worlds together. You can combine the other faction's technology to make deadly advancements of your own, like mixing the Disciple of Arnu's shredding technology with New Jericho rockets, creating the bombastic Ragnarok missile launcher. Is this combined tech the best gear in the game? No, even then it still isn't. It's just a new option for you to use, something to fill a gap in your arsenal or better complement the strategy that you're going for. Horizontal progression, a buffet of options for you to sample, decide what you like or dislike, then go back for seconds and load up on a plate of your favourites. If you're playing without Terror from the Void installed, you can decide which DLCs you'd like to enable or disable on a per campaign basis. If you play with Terror from the Void, all of the DLC is incorporated, with some of the acquisition methods, quests, or timing of events adjusted. As such, this section is mainly of use to unmodded players. So, with that out of the way, you've got the option of 6 DLC packs to use in Phoenix Point. First is the Living Weapons. To be honest, this is barely a DLC. You get 1 unique rifle, 1 unique machine gun, and 1 unique armour set, granted via a small quest chain. If the soldier carrying any of these items dies in a mission, they're gone forever. But it's included pretty much for free, and it's really not that intrusive gameplay wise. The missions are quite neat. It's alright, you might as well turn this on, it really doesn't change anything. The second is Blood and Titanium. This adds in what many new players will find to be the hardest, most unfair enemies of the early game, the Pure. The cybernetic soldiers that come stacking armour with devastating weapons and very little patience for you to learn how to deal with them before outright killing your entire team. Once you have some experience with the game mechanics, they're manageable and not really that bad. It also adds the Forsaken faction, which isn't as hard to deal with initially and makes for some interesting mission variety, as there are now more factions in the pool that the game can use on exploration missions. This DLC also adds in the Cybernetics Lab, so you can turn your own soldiers into tin cans, and has a few story missions which range from insanely easy to simply insane. The major issue that I take with the Pure quest chain is that by completing the final mission, it entirely removes the Pure from the game, so you dilute your own experience by engaging with the story. The Pure are fun to fight, especially in Haven defences, can turn up on scavenge missions or even ambushes. The worst thing is that you can tackle the last mission of the DLC before you've even seen the Pure field their tier 3 soldiers. I've suggested before that players that are very inexperienced or prone to rage quitting turn this DLC off for their first campaign, as both factions demand a solid basis of the core game mechanics, which new players are unlikely to have when they first encounter both the Pure and Forsaken in combat. The third DLC, Legacy of the Ancients. Oh god, this DLC. To keep it short, it gets you the most broken and overpowered weapons in the game. That horizontal tech tree I just mentioned? Nah. These things decided it was time to make it vertical and put it on a pair of stilts so it can stand above the rest. However, to get these weapons you need to do the most aggravating, drawn out, and brain dead missions possible. The ancient type enemies simply aren't fun to play against, and globetrotting to claim the resource generation sites and then the production sites is a lot of work when you're also dealing with other threats. Are the rewards worth it? Yeah, I guess. I mean, you can quite literally wipe an entire map in one turn if you pair some of the ancient weapons with class perks and augmentations. Is it something I want to grind every single game? Hell no. You can safely turn this DLC on and not have it interfere with other game mechanics, as you can choose simply not to engage with the ancient sites, and it does give you a few unique quests to unlock the schematics to make the ancient weapons themselves. You just won't have the materials to build them, unless you go and face the ancients. DLC 4, The Festering Skies. In theory, this DLC should have been amazing. In practice, it was solid meh across the board. Almost the entire community shrugged, and there was just an angry forum post or two from a very vocal minority. The air combat was really lacking in any depth or tension, and you had to cheese it late game or you'd be dropping aircraft left and right, with how the engagements were just poorly designed. You couldn't choose to move in any direction besides edging closer to the enemy ship. You couldn't choose to increase or decrease your thrust to move in faster or slower. The late game Pandoran craft always ran 2 dot weapons, which meant that if you got hit, you'd need to bail because you couldn't carry countermeasures for both, which is why the key was always accuracy and range. Just hit, disengage, over and over and over. You'll be bored of it by the second time the behemoth is pushed back into the sea, and you'll be glad to finally kill the thing so you don't have to deal with the mechanic anymore. The new enemy added to the ground combat from the DLC, personally, I find awful. I easily rate it my most hated enemy in the game. Yes, worse than the one that summons in reinforcements. I lost more soldiers to Myrmidons than anything else over my entire playtime. They drop wherever they feel like, entirely ignore fog of war, and they have this weird habit of jumping through ceilings or just landing in impossible places. They manage to hit you through walls, or from insane drops and rise in the elevation. The behemoth the game introduces was nothing special. There was a pretty fun final mission for it, which sees you using a team of 8 split across 2 unique areas, and I really liked the Infested Haven mechanic as an idea, but players rarely got to interact with Infested Havens because you'd have to leave the behemoth unchallenged for an extended period of time. Even then, killing the corruption node itself isn't the interesting part of the fight. You'll likely just level the building. Getting there past the waves of Pandorans was the more interesting challenge. The main benefit from this DLC was the add-ons that your aircraft can use, which weren't combat focused, such as increased speed or in-flight recovery. They're a solid quality of life addition, but you have to put up with all of the extra meh that the DLC adds to the game. DLC 5, Corrupted Horizons. Okay, this one I love. The Acheron is a complete dick, but it does make missions interesting. When you've got over a dozen enemies on the map because of the reinforcement cries and you've got all of the tools to deal with it, it's a really good feeling. It also adds in by far one of the more interesting DLC ideas with Mutoids, half human, half Pandoran soldiers which get to pick a little bit of everything ability wise and give you fantastic and stupid combos, especially the ability to launch 4 fireworms the entire length of the map. You can deny spawn points, set fire to objectives, you don't even have to leave the deployment zone. The corruption mechanic included in this is another idea in theory that's really cool. You sacrifice maximum willpower but gain a percentage damage bonus. Bad on units that use low damage high burst and need a lot of abilities, but fantastic on an infiltrator sniper who can sit on a rooftop and shoot enemies halfway across the map all game with a 40% damage buff. But then, in practice, this mechanic doesn't work. When you research the cure, you can no longer accumulate corruption, even willingly. So just like Blood and Titanium, by engaging with the DLC story missions, you remove a mechanic from your game, in turn diluting what you can play with. It's a shame, but you at least got Mutoids. DLC 6. Chaos Engines. This DLC honestly killed the game for me. For quite a while, I didn't play. The Chaos Gear and Marketplace idea was busted. And not in terms of, oh, this is amazing, but in terms of, some of this just doesn't work. Who thought this was a good idea? The upgrades for vehicles which have literally no downside and are superior to everything else you could build in every way. There were then the upgrades to the vehicles which just make them objectively worse and made it harder for them to fulfill their basic role. It feels like the system to upgrade vehicles was barely ready for release, and the modules that they ended up adding just hadn't been tested in the slightest. Someone, somewhere in a design room had to take a step back and look at what they were making, and just say, why would somebody use this when the other thing exists, before shrugging and just making it anyway? And it's these poor choices that ruin this entire system. The Chaos weapons are the addition with a little more RNG and a push your luck mechanic because they could malfunction, but they make it stupidly easy with minimal investment. You can replace them as often as they're like. They're cheaper to make than most of your normal gear, and they're ready as soon as you press the buy button on the marketplace. They make enemies that should require thought, like a Siren, possible to one bang with a Redemptor shotgun. The offset of, oh, but you need to buy a new one if it gets too broken, doesn't matter when you're drowning in resources because you breeze every single salvage mission with these handheld nukes and leave a single soldier sat in the marketplace hoovering up all the overpowered DACA. Turn it on, see how easy the game can be with vertical progression of the highest degree, then turn it back off and see how much more fun you have out of the combat by engaging with the enemy instead of just annihilating them. the Terror from the Void essential changes. I say this with a huge caveat that in the time I've recorded this VO, after having written the script and after getting my video footage, there's been a multitude of patches, and I keep reading the patch notes, they're really active, so if I'm saying anything wrong here and there's anyone from the Terror from the Void team watching, I do apologise. But onwards. So, why do I go with Terror from the Void over Vanilla? I already said I'm not the biggest fan of the two DLCs, and Terror from the Void requires all of them to be active. Without wanting to sound melodramatic, Terror from the Void changes, well, everything. To begin with, the DLC is better weaved into the game throughout. It slows the introduction of some mechanics, such as the Behemoth, and better integrates the DLCs to interact together rather than feeling like standalone modules. The biggest change is replacing the corruption mechanic with the overall threat of Oniric Delirium, which better ties together corruption, mutations, bionics, and mutoids. The DLC also introduces Touched by the Void to make enemies less predictable, incorporating multiple mechanics so that dealing with a void-touched enemy is no longer as simple as it was to deal with an Umbra-infested Pandoran. And best of all, you get Void Omens. Void Omens are Terror from the Void's answer to the question, what about dark events? A creeping dread that infests the minds of your soldiers and the population over the world, creating unforeseen bumps along the journey that make missions more engaging and more challenging. Not only that, there's more. Revenants haunt you, reminders of your past mistakes, the soldiers who died for their cause, arriving to bolster the enemy against you and making certain tactics less effective in specific missions. This also works similarly to the newly introduced enemy squad specializations, with humanoid enemies being given a unique buff or bonus at the start of combat that you'll need to work around and figure out a way to deal with. Every single new mechanic added by Terror from the Void goes a long way in asking, how can we make each fight less predictable, without going overboard and making the game some random mess? It's a sprinkling of the correct seasoning, rather than a douchebag with tiny glasses pouring salt down his arm and ruining your steak. Those are the major new mechanics, but there's so many other changes to mention. Pandoran progression has changed so that fighting the Pandorans no longer speeds up their evolution. It's instead tied to how many colonies they have or how many havens they've infested, meaning you don't catapult the enemy up the tech tree by just performing well in missions repeatedly. The exploration nodes have also been rebalanced to make ambushes more likely, so scouring the world with a single soldier is now far more dangerous as a tactic. Not to worry, you might say, it's only one soldier, so if they die, it's still not a problem. Wrong. Terror from the Void also added resource crates to the ambush missions to make them more rewarding for completing. After all, the frequency of scavenge missions has been dropped to make more room for the ambush missions, so now you'll need to make every pack of materials that you find really count. The pacing of the game has also changed with the introduction of more severe penalties for soldiers who suffer broken limbs in combat. In Vanilla, you can patch a soldier up with a medpack, pat them on the butt, and they'll just be missing 10 HP the next time you deploy them, as the limb was restored immediately after they left the prior fight, which in turn raised their max HP capacity back to full. Whilst you can still heal a soldier back up and try to throw them straight back into combat in Terror from the Void, they'll be exhausted. Recovering from a broken limb takes time. To represent this, the soldier loses their entire stamina bar upon taking a serious wound, being mutated, or augmented. It's only a small change, but it means that you can't throw augmentations onto soldiers right before a mission. You need to pick a good time to do it. You also can't throw your soldiers into the meat grinder repeatedly and expect them to want to dive straight back in. If you're heading to a haven defense and another pops up very close to it, you find yourself taking extra care in the first to ensure that no soldiers will be winded for the second. Small changes like this are what adds up to make it a much tighter, more engaging tactical experience. Diplomacy has seen a huge overhaul, especially in regards to penalties. There were many campaigns in Vanilla that I just hit 100 reputation with all factions without even thinking about it. Consequences were rarely an issue, even for being openly hostile with dialogue choices or aircraft thievery. As long as you destroyed nests, lairs and citadels, the world loved you. Now, if you favour one side, the other two notice, and they are not quiet in their dismissal of your approach to playing World Police, with siding with the Disciples of Anu appearing to cause the most significant upset by far. Timing the diplomatic missions is now something you actually need to consider carefully. It can easily tip you over into negative triggers with other parties, making them no longer want to work with you, meaning you'll have to pay a personal visit to their research centres if you want to unlock their secrets, which is even more likely to aggravate them. One of the biggest and most pleasing changes was the alteration to the Behemoth. It is no longer allowed to roam freely across the land and destroy any haven it sees fit. Now it can only damage them. Not only that, it relies on the smaller Pandoran craft to scout a location before it makes its way over. If you can kill the scout craft before it makes it there, it renders it unable to attack, and it forces it to pick a new target. A fantastic change for those who felt that it was unfair that sometimes no matter how well you defended the world, this big floating numpty would just roam about and flatten everything as the player could only sit back and watch in disgust. And the biggest change, which has been mentioned in the class section of this video, is the integration of better classes, making for a much more unique soldier with a variety of modifiers that can change their skills. This change alone did a lot to help Phoenix Point, as it made soldiers far less formulaic, placing more importance on which order the soldier was trained, with primary and secondary class differences, as well as the location they were recruited and the changing traits that they could get, which were a little bit RNG. It ended up falling into less reliance on lucky perk rolls and more reliance on smart candidate choice. There are numerous balance changes as well. There's value tweaks, small alterations, just bring some of the strange outliers more in line with the game, something to incentivize using other equipment rather than your old reliable every single time. It was nice to see even items like the Disciple of Anu pistol got attention, something that I imagine many players will look at and go, oh, before proceeding to never use pistols anyway. You can just tell that these guys care, and it means a lot as a player who loves this game, warts and all. Point 5. Conclusion. So, that's the meat of it. That's the tools that you're given, the challenges you're going to face, and the options afforded to you. This video retrospective was never intended as a strategy guide, nor was it made as an exact breakdown of every individual thing that this game offers. I don't feel that digging into the history of development or dragging the game through the mud over its somewhat unfavourable launch is particularly beneficial for the retrospective either. Others that are far bigger and more established in the YouTube space have already done this. The game is what it is, regardless of how it got here or how many years it took. This is, in essence, a long rambling love letter to something that has given me so many hours of joy. After I got beyond those initial frustrating sessions of unlearning some of my prior tactics gameplay habits and understanding what Phoenix Point actually wanted from me, this is just a plea to tactics gamers out there. This game doesn't immediately click. There are those that do, and those that do are rare, and stand high above the crowd. Those games don't need a video telling you why you should try it. You already own it because it launched to critical acclaim. You've already beaten it. You've already purchased all of the DLC and finished that too. But Phoenix Point, this is a game that's sitting in thousands of players' libraries, marked with 3.4 hours played, no achievements earned. 25% of players don't own the achievement for manufacturing an item. That is one click that you can do as soon as the game starts. Just make a medkit. Done. So, maybe you've made it this far and feel that the previous statement describes you. And whilst this video has been playing in the background because Lord knows no one's devoting their full attention to this, you've searched in your Steam library. You found it and hovered over that install button. You're unsure if you want to invest the time to learn this game because I've not exactly sung its praises all the way through. It undeniably has issues. Most games do. But I implore you, pick it back up, throw on Terraform the Void, and get ready to break out an emergency calculator. I can't describe in words what happens when the things in Phoenix Point line up correctly, but the satisfaction is off the charts. It's this feeling that you are so in control of what's going on, a familiar and comforting situation, like walking in the streets of your hometown knowing every little thing that's coming. You can look around and appreciate the journey, take in anything new and adapt to the changes. This isn't loud, shouty or unexpected. It's understandable and presented to you in a clear and elegant way. Whilst I always enjoy my time with something like XCOM, there is an undeniable essence of the dice rolled in my favour today. Even when a mission goes spectacularly well, it was never all on me. But with Phoenix Point, it's something I earned. I moved that assault exactly there to take that shot, which ensured that I still had the movement range to turn around and make it back to the team. That let me swap the Berserker's backpack item into their ready item, so they didn't have to spend that 1 AP on their inventory management, and instead, that allowed them to run in and get a clean hit. That killed another enemy that threatened us. The issue that I outlined at the start of this video, that thing that eats away at you, it's your fault, it's your fault. You're damn right it's my fault. It was my fault that I got this team out without a scratch. It was my fault that I juggled that medkit across to save that soldier's life before they bled out. It was my fault that that part of the map was cut off. It funneled enemies into my meat grinder of overwatches. You own your success in Phoenix Point. The only other game that has come close to that for me is Chaos Gate. That's because it removes the RNG and uses precise numbers and exact actions. You still have the potential to miss shots, as your aim can never be exact. There are still unexpected turns, enemies you didn't see, outcomes you couldn't predict, or shots you wouldn't have imagined could land. But you choose what happens next. Not the dice, not the numbers, you do. I hope, in some way, that I broke this game apart just enough to make those who never dove in that deeply feel comfortable enough to dip a toe in and try again. And for those who already loved this game, I hope that I did it justice in explaining why it holds such a special place for us. I'd like to thank all who have made it this far. This was one of the biggest projects I've ever worked on, and something I've wanted to do for a long time. This has been a ridiculous amount of work, and I'm putting it into something that will surely die in obscurity on YouTube, but it was never about that. It was about the thanks for a weird little game about shooting crabs in the face to save the world. So for all the hours of entertainment you have given me, thank you, Phoenix Point. Here's to 1,000 more.